Section 20 of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Claude Banta. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author. Edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1, The Annals, Book 2, Part 2, Libo's Rebellion. The summer now declining, some of the legions were sent back into winter quarters by land. More were embarked with Germanicus upon the river Amisia, to go from thence by the ocean. The sea at first was serene, no sound or agitation except from the oars or sails of 1,000 ships. But suddenly a black host of clouds poured a storm of hail, furious winds roared on every side, and the tempest darkened the deep, so that all prospect was lost, and it was impossible to steer. The soldiers, too, unaccustomed to the terrors of the sea, in the hurry of fear disordered the mariners, or interrupted the skilful by unskilful help. At last, the south wind, mastering all the rest, drove the ocean and the sky. The tempest derived new force from the windy mountains and swelling rivers of Germany, as well as from an immense train of clouds, and contracting with all fresh vigor from the boisterous neighborhood of the north, it hurled the ships and tossed them into the open ocean, or against islands shored with deep rocks, or dangerously beset with covered shoals. The ships, by degrees, with great labor, and the change of the tide, were relieved from the rocks and sands, but remained at the mercy of the winds. Their anchors could not hold them. They were full of water, nor could all the pumps discharge it. Hence, to lighten and raise the vessels swallowing at their decks the invading waves, the horses, beasts, baggage, and even the arms were cast into the deep. By how much the German Ocean is more outrageous than the rest of the sea, and the German climate excels in vigor, by so much this ruin was reckoned to exceed in greatness and novelty. They were engaged in a tempestuous sea, believed deep without bottom, vast without bounds, no shores near but hostile shores. Part of the fleet were swallowed up, many were driven upon remote islands void of human culture, where the men perished through famine, or were kept alive by the carcasses of horses cast in by the flood. Only the galley of Germanicus landed upon the coast of the Chaucians, where, wandering sadly day and night upon the rocks and prominent shore, and incessantly accusing himself as the author of such mighty destruction, he was hardly restrained by his friends from casting himself desperately into the same hostile floods. At last, with the returning tide and an assisting gale, the ships began to return, all maimed, almost destitute of oars, or with coats spread for sails, and some, utterly disabled, were dragged by those that were less. He repaired them hastily, and dispatched them to search the islands, and by this care many men were gleaned up. Many were, by the Angevarians, our new subjects, redeemed from their maritime neighbors, and restored, and some driven into Great Britain, where sent back by the little British kings. Those who had come from afar recounted wonders at their return. The impetuosity of whirlwinds, wonderful birds, sea monsters of ambiguous forms between man and beast, strange flights, or the effects of imagination and fear. The noise of this wreck, as it animated the Germans with hopes of renewing the war, awakened Germanicus also to restraint. He commanded Caius Silius with 30,000 foot and 3,000 horse to march against the Catians. He himself, with a greater force, invaded the Marsians, where he learnt from Mallovenus, their general, lately taken into our subjection, that the eagle of one of Varus's legions was hid underground in a neighboring grove, and kept by a slender guard. Instantly 2 parties were dispatched, one to face the enemy and provoke them from their post, the other to beset their rear and dig up the eagle. and success attended both. Hence Germanicus advanced with greater alacrity, laid waste the country, and smote the foe, either not daring to engage, or, wherever they engaged, suddenly defeated. Nor, as we learnt from the prisoners, were they ever seized with greater dismay. "The Romans," they cried, "are invincible. No calamities can subdue them. They have wrecked their fleet, their arms are lost, our shores are covered with the bodies of their horses and men, yet they attack us with their usual ferocity, with the same firmness, and with numbers, as it were, increased." The army was from thence led back into winter quarters, full of joy to have balanced, by this prosperous expedition, their late misfortune at sea, and, by the bounty of Germanicus, their joy was heightened, since to each sufferer he caused to be paid as much as he declared he had lost. Neither was it doubted but the enemy were humbled, and concerting measures for obtaining peace, and that the next summer would terminate the war. But Tiberius, by frequent letters, urged him to come home there to celebrate the triumph already decreed him. He had already tried enough of events, and tempted abundant hazards. He had indeed fought great and successful battles, but he must likewise remember his losses and calamities, which, however, owing to wind and waves, and no fault of the general, were yet great and grievous. He himself had been sent 9 times into Germany by Augustus, and affected much more by policy than arms. It was thus he had brought the Segumbrians into subjection, thus drawn the Suevians and King Marabudus under the bonds of peace. The Cheruscans too, and the other hostile nations, now the Roman vengeance was satiated, might be left to pursue their own national feuds. Germanicus besought 1 year to accomplish his conquest, but Tiberius assailed his modesty with a new bait and fresh importunity, by offering him another consulship, for the administration of which he was to attend in person at Rome. He added that if the war was still to be prosecuted, Germanicus should leave the field of glory to his brother Drusus, to whom there now remained no other, since the empire had nowhere a war to maintain but in Germany, and thence only Drusus could acquire the title of imperator and merit the triumphal laurel. Germanicus persisted no longer, though he knew that this was all feigned and hollow, and saw himself invidiously torn away from a harvest of ripe glory. About this time Lebo Drusus, of the Scribonian family, was arraigned for meditating attempts against the state, and because then first were devised those pestilent arts and impeachments, which for so many years devoured the commonwealth, I will lay open with more exactness the beginning, progress, and issue of this affair. Firmius Catus, the senator, a close confidant of Lebo, traitorously misled that youth, unwary as he was, and easy to be ensnared, with specious delusions, engaged him to try the predictions of the Chaldeans, the superstitious rites of the magicians, and the interpreters of dreams, and to flatter his hopes and ambition, was incessantly magnifying the nobility of his race, for that Pompey was his great-grandfather, Scribonia, once the wife of Augustus, his aunt, the Caesars his kinsman, and his house full of images, tempted him to luxury and borrowing, was associated with him in his debauches, surety for his debts, and all to accumulate more matter for crimes and evidence. When he found himself furnished with store of witnesses, and amongst them some of Lebo's slaves, who were also privy to the obnoxious conduct of their master, he sought admittance to the emperor, having first by Flaccus Vescalarius, a Roman knight, intimate with Tiberius, represented to him Lebo as a criminal, as also a detail of his crimes. Tiberius slighted not his information, but denied him access, for that the communication, he said, might still be managed by the same Flaccus. In the meantime he preferred Lebo to the praetorship, entertained him at his table, shewed no strangeness in his countenance, no resentment in his words, so deeply had he smothered his vengeance, and when he might have restrained all the dangerous speeches and practices of Lebo, he chose rather to permit them in order to know and punish them. Nor were they checked or made public, till one Junius, who was dealt with to call up by charms the infernal shades, discovered this to Fulcinius Trio, a distinguished accuser, one greedy of renown in wickedness. Instantly Trio marked out the doom of the accused, hastened to the consuls, and one of them demanded that the Senate might meet and adjudge him. This the fathers were forthwith summoned, and even prized, that upon an affair of mighty moment and horrible tendency to the state they were to deliberate. Libo, the while, having changed his dress, went covered with mourning from house to house, accompanied by ladies of the noblest rank, and implored the mediation of his kindred, that they would protect him against impending ruin, and speak in his behalf. But every one of them declined his suit, each upon a different pretense, yet in reality all from the same fear. The day the Senate sat for his trial, vanquished with dread and sinking under sickness, or as some relate, feigning it, he was borne in a litter to the court, and, leaning upon his brother, with supplicant hands and words, he accosted and strove to soften Tiberius, who received him with a countenance perfectly unmoved. It was the emperor who next recited the charge against him, and the authors of the charge, but with such wary moderation that he might seem neither to soften nor sharpen his crimes. To Trio and Catus, two other accusers, Fonteius Agrippa and Caius Vibius, joined themselves and strove who should have the right to implead the accused. At last, when neither would yield, and Libo was come unprovided with a pleader, Vibius undertook to maintain distinctly the several heads of the charge, and produced articles so extravagant, that amongst the rest it was one, how Libo had consulted the fortune-tellers, whether he should ever be master of opulence sufficient to cover the great Appian road with money as far as Brundusium. There were other accusers of the same kind, foolish, chimerical, or, taken in tenderer sense, deserving pity. But there was one article formed upon a paper, containing the names of the Caesars, as well as those of some senators, with mysterious characters and malignant notes joined to them. This the accused urged against Libo, as written in his own hand. Libo denied it, and hence it was proposed to examine by torture his conscious slaves. But, seeing it was forbid by an ancient law of the Senate to put the servants to the question in a trial touching the life of their master, the crafty Tiberius invented a new law to elude the old, and ordered these slaves to be sold to the public steward, that, by this expedient, evidence against Libo might be racked from his servants without violating the law. In this state of despondency, Libo requested respite till the next day, and then returning to his own house, transmitted, by his kinsman Publius Cornelius, his last prayers to the emperor, who replied that he must make his request to the Senate. His house was in the meantime encompassed with a band of soldiers, who, with studied noise and terror, were filling all the court on purpose to create certain attention and alarm, just when Libo sat down to the banquet, which, as the ultimate pleasure of his life, he had prepared. But then, feeling agonies instead of pleasure, he called for a minister of death, successively grasped the hands of his slaves, and into them, by turns, strove to squeeze a sword. But they, as they trembled and shunned the sad task, through the hurry of fear and flight, overturning the lamp that illuminated the table, in this ominous and tragical darkness he gave himself 2 deadly stabs in the bowels. As he groaned and fell, his freedmen sprang in, and the soldiers, seeing the slaughter perpetrated, retired. The charge against him, however, was pushed in the Senate with the same unrelenting eagerness. Yet Tiberius vowed that he would have interceded for his life, notwithstanding his treason, if he had not thus hastily died by his own hands. His estate was divided amongst his accusers, and those of them who bore the rank of senators were, without the regular way of election, preferred to praetorships. Then Cota Messalinus proposed that the image of Libo might not accompany the funerals of his posterity. Gnaeus Lentulus, that none of the Scriboni should henceforth assume the surname of Drusus, and, at the motion of Pompeius Flaccus, days of thanksgiving were appointed, that gifts should be prepared to Jupiter, to Mars, and to the goddess Concord, and that the 13th of September, the day on which Libo slew himself, should be an established festival, where the votes of Lucius Publius, of Asinius Gallus, of Papius Motilius, and of Lucius Apronius. I have related the votes and sycophancy of these men, to shew that adulation is an inveterate evil in the state. Decrees of the Senate were likewise made for driving astrologers and magicians out of Italy, and one of the herd, Lucius Pituanius, was precipitated from the Tarpetian rock. Publius Marcius, another, was by judgment of the consuls, at the sound of trumpet, executed without the Escaline gate, according to the ancient form. End of section 20.
Section 21 of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Graham Redman. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author, edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1, The Annals, Book 2, Section 3, Debates in the Senate. Next time the Senate sat, long discourses against the luxury of the city were made by Quintus Haterius, a consular, and by Octavius Fronto, formerly praetor, and a law was passed against using table plate of solid gold, and against men's debasing themselves with gorgeous and effeminate silks. Fronto went farther, and desired that the quantities of silver plate, the expense of furniture, and the number of domestics might be limited. For it was yet common for senators to depart from the present debate, and offer, as their advice, whatever they judged conducing to the interests of the common weal. Against him it was argued by Asinius Gallus that with the growth of the empire private riches were likewise grown, and it was no new thing for citizens to live according to their conditions, but indeed agreeable to the most primitive usage. The ancient Fabricii and the latter Scipios, having different wealth, lived differently, but all suitably to the several stages of the commonwealth. Public poverty was accompanied with domestic, but when the state rose to such a height of magnificence, the magnificence of particulars rose too. As to plate and train and expense, there was no standard of excess or frugality but from the fortunes of men. The law, indeed, had made a distinction between the fortunes of senators and of knights, not for any natural difference between them, but that they who excelled in place, rank, and civil preeminence might excel too in other particulars, such as conduced to the health of the body or to the peace and solacement of the soul, unless it were expected that the most illustrious citizens should sustain the sharpest cares and undergo the heaviest fatigues and dangers, but continue destitute of every alleviation of fatigue and danger and care. Gallus easily prevailed whilst under worthy names he avowed and supported popular vices in an assembly engaged in them. Tiberius, too, had said that it was not a season for reformation, or if there were any corruption of manners, there would not be wanting one to correct them. During these transactions, Lucius Piso, after he had declaimed bitterly in the Senate against the cabals and intrigues of the Forum, the corruption of the tribunals, and the inhumanity of the pleaders breathing continual terror and impeachments, declared he would entirely relinquish Rome and retire into a quiet corner of the country far distant and obscure. With these words he left the Senate. Tiberius was provoked, and yet not only soothed him with gentle words, but likewise obliged Piso's relations by their authority or entreaties to retain him. The same Piso gave soon after an equal instance of the indignation of a free spirit, by prosecuting a suit against Ergulania, a lady whom the partial friendship of Livia had set at defiance with the laws. Ergulania, being carried for protection to the palace, despised the efforts of Piso, so that neither did she submit nor would he desist, notwithstanding the complaints and resentments of Livia that in the prosecution violence and indignity were done to her own person. Tiberius promised to attend the trial and assist Ergulania, but only promised in civility to his mother, for so far he thought it became him, and thus left the palace, ordering his guards to follow at a distance. People the while crowded about him, and he walked with a slow and composed air. As he lingered and prolonged the time and way with various discourse, the trial went on. Piso would not be mollified by the importunity of his friends, and hence at last the empress ordered the payment of the money claimed by him. This was the issue of the affair. By it Piso lost no renown, and it signally increased the credit of Tiberius. The power, however, of Ergulania was so exorbitant to the state that she disdained to appear a witness in a certain cause before the Senate, and, when it had been always usual even for the Vestal Virgins to attend the forum and courts of justice as oft as their evidence was required, a praetor was sent to examine Ergulania at her own house. The procrastination which happened this year in the public affairs I should not mention, but that the different opinions of Cnaeus Piso and Asinius Gallus about it are worth knowing. Their dispute was occasioned by a declaration of Tiberius that he was about to be absent, and it was the motion of Piso that for that very reason the prosecution of public business was the rather to be continued, since, as in the prince's absence the Senate and equestrian order might administer their several parts, the same would become the dignity of the commonwealth. This was a declaration for liberty, and in it Piso had prevented Gallus, who now in opposition said that nothing sufficiently illustrious nor suiting the dignity of the Roman people could be transacted but under the immediate eye of the emperor, and therefore the conflux of suitors and the affairs from Italy and the provinces must by all means be reserved for his presence. Tiberius heard and was silent, while the debate was managed on both sides with mighty vehemence, but the adjournment was carried. A debate, too, arose between Gallus and the emperor, for Gallus moved that the magistrates should be henceforth elected but once every 5 years, that the legates of the legions who had never exercised the praetorships should be appointed praetors, and that the prince should nominate 12 candidates every year. It was not doubted but this motion had a deeper aim, and that by it the secret springs and reserves of imperial power were invaded. But Tiberius, as if he rather apprehended the augmentation of his authority, argued that it was a heavy task upon his moderation to choose so many magistrates, and to postpone so many candidates, that disgusts from disappointments were hardly avoided in yearly elections, though for their solacement fresh hopes remained of approaching success in the next. Now how great must be the hatred, how lasting the resentment of such whose pretensions were to be rejected beyond 5 years! And whence could it be foreseen that in so long a tract of time the same men would continue to have the same dispositions, the same alliances and fortunes? Even an annual designation to power made men imperious. How imperious would it make them if they bore the honour for 5 years? Besides, it would multiply every single magistrate into 5, and utterly subvert the laws which had prescribed a proper space for exercising the diligence of the candidates, and for soliciting as well as enjoying preferments. By this speech, in appearance popular, he still retained the spirit and force of the sovereignty. He likewise sustained by gratuities the dignity of some necessitous senators. Hence it was the more wondered that he received with haughtiness and repulse the petition of Marcus Hortulus, a young man of signal quality and manifestly poor. He was the grandson of Hortensius the orator, and had been encouraged by the deified Augustus with a bounty of 1,000 great sesterces to marry for posterity, purely to prevent the extinction of a family so eminently illustrious. The Senate was sitting in the palace, and Hortulus, having set his 4 children before the door, fixed his eyes now upon the statue of Hortensius placed amongst the orators, then upon that of Augustus, and, instead of speaking to the question then debated, began on this wise: "Conscript fathers, you see there the number and infancy of my children, not mine by my own choice, but in compliance with the advice of the prince. Such, too, was the splendor of my ancestors, that it merited to be perpetuated in their race. But for my own particular, who, marred by the revolution of the times, could not raise wealth, nor engage popular favour, nor cultivate the hereditary fortune of our house, the fortune of eloquence, I deemed it sufficient if, in my narrow circumstances, I lived no disgrace to myself, no burden to others. Commanded by the emperor, I took a wife. Behold the offspring of so many consuls, behold the descendants of so many dictators. Nor is this remembrance invidiously made, but made to move mercy. In the progress of your reign, Caesar, these children may arrive at the honours in your gift. Defend them in the meantime from want. They are the great-grandsons of Hortensius, they are the foster sons of Augustus." The inclination of the Senate was favourable, an incitement to Tiberius the more eagerly to thwart Hortulus. These were in effect his words: "If all that are poor recur hither for a provision of money to their children, the public will certainly fail, yet particulars never be satiated. Our ancestors, when they permitted a departure from the question, to propose somewhat more important to the state, did not therefore permit it, that we might here transact domestic matters, and augment our private rents, an employment invidious both in the Senate and the prince. Since, whether they grant or deny the petition bounties, either the people or the petitioners will ever be offended. But these, in truth, are not petitions, they are demands made against order, and made by surprise. While you are assembled upon other affairs, he stands up and urges your pity by the number and infancy of his children. With the same violence he changes the attack to me, and, as it were, bursts open the exchequer. But if by popular bounties we exhaust it, by rapine and oppression we must supply it. The deified Augustus gave you money, Hortulus, but without solicitation he gave it, and on no condition that it should always be given. Otherwise diligence will languish, sloth will prevail, and men, having no hopes in resources of their own, no anxiety for themselves, but all securely relying on foreign relief, will become private sluggards and public burdens." These and the like reasonings of Tiberius were differently received, with approbation by those whose way it is to extol without distinction all the doings of princes, worthy and unworthy, by most, however, with silence or low and discontented murmurs. Tiberius perceived it, and having paused a little, said his answer was particularly to Hortulus, but if the Senate thought fit, he would give his sons 200 great sesterces each. For this all the senators presented their thanks. Only Hortulus said nothing, perhaps through present awe, or perhaps possessed, even in poverty, with the grandeur of his ancient nobility. Nor did Tiberius ever show farther pity, though the house of Hortensius was fallen into shameful distress. End of section 21.
Section 22 of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Claude Banta. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author. Edited and translated by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1. The Annals, Book 2, Part 4, Various Rebellions. The same year, the boldness of a single bondman had, but for early prevention, borne the state with great combustions and civil arms. A slave of Posthumus Agrippa, his name Clemens, having learnt the death of Augustus, conceived a design to sail to Planasia, and there, releasing Agrippa by art or force, to carry him to the armies in Germany. No slavish design, but the slowness of the laden vessel defeated his bold purpose, for Agrippa was already murdered. Hence he conceived views still higher and more daring. He stole the funeral ashes, and sailing to Cosa, a promontory of Etruria, hid himself in desert places, till his hair and beard were grown long. For in age and person he was not unlike his master. Then a report spread by trusty emissaries and the associates of the plot, that Agrippa lived, began to thicken. It first crept abroad in dark whispers, as usual in matters of dangerous tendency, but becoming soon a prevailing rumor, it filled the greedy ears of the credulous, or was encouraged by turbulent minds, such as are ever fond of public agitations and changes. He himself, when he entered the neighboring towns, did it in the gloom of the day, never to be seen publicly, nor long in the same place. But as truth is strengthened by observation and time, lies by haste and uncertainty, he outran fame. Here he stayed not to be known, there he arrived before his name arrived. It flew through Italy in the meantime, that, by the bounty of the gods, Agrippa was preserved. It was even believed at Rome. His supposed arrival at Ostia was celebrated by great multitudes abroad, and in the city by clandestine cabals, whilst divided cares distracted Tiberius, whether he should suppress his slave by the power of the sword, or suffer the empty credulity of the public to vanish with time. Now he thought that nothing was to be slighted, now that every thing was not to be dreaded, wavering between shame and fear. At last he committed the affair to Celestius Crispus. Crispus chose 2 of his creatures, some say 2 soldiers, and directed them to go directly to him, to feign themselves his adherents, men who were conscious that he was the genuine Agrippa, to present him with money, and to promise him, without reserve, their faith and fortunes. They instantly executed these orders, and afterwards, spying him one night without guards, and being themselves furnished with a proper band of men, they carried him to the palace, gagged and bound. To Tiberius, when he asked him how he was become Agrippa, he is said to have answered, "Just as you became Caesar." But to discover his accomplices he could never be constrained. Neither dared Tiberius venture to execute him publicly, but ordered him to be dispatched in a secret part of the palace, and his body to be carried privately away. And though many of the prince's household, many knights and senators, were said to have supported him with money and assisted him with their counsels, no enquiry followed. At the end of the year, a triumphal arch was raised near the temple of Saturn, as a monument for the recovery of the Varian eagles under the conduct of Germanicus and the auspices of Tiberius. A temple was directed to Happy Fortune near the Tiber, in the gardens bequeathed to the Roman people by Caesar the Dictator. A chapel was consecrated to the Julian family, and statues to the deified Augustus in the suburbs called Bovillae. In the consulship of Caius Celius and Lucius Pomponius, the 6th and 20th of May, Germanicus Caesar triumphed over the Cheruscans, the Catians, the Angevarians, and the other nations as far as the Elbe. In the triumph were carried all the spoils and captives, with the representations of mountains, of rivers, and of battles, so that his conquests, because he was restrained from completing them, were taken for complete. His own graceful person, and his chariot filled with his 5 children, heightened the shew and the delight of the beholders. Yet they were checked with secret fears, as they remembered that popular favour had proved malignant to his father Drusus, that his uncle Marcellus was snatched in his youth from the burning affections of the populace, and that ever short-lived and unfortunate were the favourites of the Roman people. Tiberius distributed to the people, in the name of Germanicus, 300 sesterces a man, and named himself his colleague in the consulship. Nor even thus did he gain the opinion of tenderness and sincerity. In effect, on pretence of investing the young prince with fresh preferment and honours, he resolved to alienate him from Rome, and, to accomplish it, craftily framed an occasion, or snatched such a one as chance presented. Archelaus had enjoyed the kingdom of Cappadocia now 50 years, a prince under the deep displeasure of Tiberius, because, in his retirement at Rhodes, the king had paid him no sort of court nor distinction, an omission which proceeded from no disdain, but from the warnings given him by the confidants of Augustus. For that the young Caius Caesar, the presumptive heir to the sovereignty, then lived, and was sent to compose and administer the affairs of the East. Hence the friendship of Tiberius was reckoned then dangerous. But when, by the utter fall of the family of the Caesars, he had gained the empire, he enticed Archelaus to Rome, by means of letters from his mother, who, without dissembling her son's resentment, offered the king his mercy, provided he came and in person implored it. He, who was either ignorant of the snare, or dreaded violence if he had appeared to perceive it, hastened to the city, where he was received by Tiberius with great sternness and wrath, and soon after accused as a criminal in the Senate. The crimes alleged against him were mere fictions, yet, as equal treatment is unusual to kings, and to be treated like malefactors intolerable, Archelaus, who was broken with grief as well as age, by choice or fate ended his life. His kingdom was reduced into a province, and by its revenues Tiberius declared the tax of the 100th penny would be abated, and reduced it for the future to the 200th. At the same time died Antiochus, king of Commagena, as also Philopater, king of Cilicia, and great combustions shook these nations, whilst many of the people desired the Roman government, and many were addicted to domestic monarchy. The princes too of Syria and Judea, as they were oppressed with impositions, prayed an abatement of tribute. These affairs, and such as I have above related concerning Armenia, Tiberius represented to the fathers, and that the commotions of the East could only be settled by the wisdom and abilities of Germanicus. For himself, his age now declined, and that of Drusus was not yet sufficiently ripe. The provinces beyond the sea were thence decreed to Germanicus, with authority superior to all those who obtained provinces by lot, or the nomination of the prince. But Tiberius had already taken care to remove from the government of Syria Creticus Silanus, one united to Germanicus in domestic alliance, by having betrothed his daughter to Nero, the eldest son of Germanicus. In his room he had preferred Gnaeus Piso, a man of violent temper, incapable of subjection, and heir to all the ferocity and haughtiness of his father Piso, the same who in the civil war assisted the reviving party against Caesar in Africa with vehement efforts, then followed Brutus and Cassius, but had at last leave to come home, yet disdained to sue for any public offices, nay, was even courted by Augustus to accept the consulship. His son, besides his hereditary pride and impetuosity, was elevated with the nobility and wealth of Plancina his wife. Scarce yielded he to Tiberius, and, as men far beneath him, despised the sons of Tiberius. Neither did he doubt, but he was set over Syria on purpose to defeat all the views of Germanicus. Some even believed that he had to this purpose secret orders from Tiberius, as it was certain that Livia directed Plancina to exert the spirit of the sex, and, by constant emulation and indignities, to persecute Agrippina, for the whole court was rent, and their affections secretly divided between Drusus and Germanicus. Tiberius was partial to Drusus, as his own son by generation. Others loved Germanicus the more for the aversion of his uncle, and for being, by his mother, of more illustrious descent, as Mark Antony was his grandfather, and Augustus his great-uncle. On the other side, Pomponius Atticus, a Roman knight, by being the great-grandfather of Drusus, seemed thence to have derived a stain upon the images of the Claudian house. Besides, Agrippina, the wife of Germanicus, did, in the fruitfulness of her body and the reputation of her virtue, far excel Livia, the wife of Drusus. Yet the two brothers lived in amiable dearness and concord, no wife shaken or estranged by the reigning contention amongst their separate friends and adherents. Drusus was soon after sent into Illyricum in order to inure him to war and gain him the affections of the army. Besides, Tiberius thought that the youth, who lived wantoning in the luxuries of Rome, would be reformed in the camp, and that his own security would be enlarged when both his sons were at the head of the legions. But the pretense for sending him was the protection of the Suevians, who were then imploring assistance against the power of the Cheruscans. For these nations, who, since the departure of the Romans, saw themselves no longer threatened with terrors from abroad, and were then particularly engaged in a national competition for glory, had relapsed as usual into their old intestine feuds, and turned their arms upon each other. These two people were equally powerful, their two leaders equally brave, but differently esteemed, as the title of king had drawn upon Maroboduus the hate and aversion of their countrymen, whilst Arminius, as a champion warring for the defence of liberty, was the universal object of popular affection. Hence, not only the Cheruscans and their confederates, they who had been the ancient soldiery of Arminius, took arms, but to him too revolted the Semnones and Langobards, both Suevian nations, and even subjects of Maroboduus, and by their accession he would have exceeded in puissance. But Ingiomarus, with his band of followers, deserted to Maroboduus, for no other cause than disdain. Then an old man and an uncle like himself should obey Arminius, a young man, his nephew. Both armies were drawn out with equal hopes, nor disjointed, like the old German battles, into scattered parties for loose and random attacks. For, by long war with us, they had learnt to follow their ensigns, to strengthen their main body with parties of reserve, and to observe the orders of their generals. Arminius was now on horseback. Viewing all the ranks as he rode through them, he magnified their past feats. Their liberty recovered, the slaughtered legions, the spoils of arms wrested from the Romans, monuments of victory still retained in some of their hands. Upon Maroboduus he fell with contumelious names, as a fugitive, one of no abilities in war, a coward who had sought defence from the gloomy coverts of the Hercynian wood, and then by gifts and solicitations courted the alliance of Rome, a betrayer of his country, a lifeguard man of Caesar's, worthy to be exterminated with no less hostile vengeance than in the slaughter of Quintilius Varus they had shewn. Let them only remember so many battles bravely fought, these events, of which particularly the utter expulsion of the Romans, were sufficient proofs with whom remained the glory of the war. Neither did Maroboduus fail to boast himself and depreciate the foe. In the person of Ingiomarus, he said, holding him by the hand, rested the whole renown of the Cheruscans, and from his counsels began all their exploits that ended in success. Arminius, a man of frantic spirit and a novice in affairs, assumed to himself the glory of another, for having by treachery surprised 3 legions, which expected no foe, and their leader, who feared no fraud, a base surprise, revenged since on Germany with heavy slaughters, and on Arminius himself with domestic infamy, while his wife and his son still bore the bonds of captivity. For himself, when attacked formerly by Tiberius at the head of 12 legions, he had preserved unstained the glory of Germany, and on equal terms ended the war. Nor did he repent of the treaty, since it was still in their hands to wage a new equal war with the Romans, or save blood and maintain peace. The armies, besides the incitements from these speeches, were animated by national stimulations of their own. The Cheruscans fought for their ancient renown, the Langobards for their recent liberty, and the Suevians and their king, on the contrary, were struggling for the augmentation of their monarchy. Never did armies make a fiercer onset. Never had onset a more ambiguous event, for both the right wings were routed, and hence a fresh encounter was certainly expected, until Maroboduus drew off his army and encamped upon the hills, a manifest sign that he was humbled. Frequent desertions too leaving him at last naked of forces, he retired to the Marcomannians, and thence sent ambassadors to Tiberius to implore succors. They were answered, that he had no right to invoke aid of the Roman arms against the Cheruscans, since to the Romans, while they were warring with the same foe, he had never administered any assistance. Drusus was, however, sent away, as I have said, with the character of a negotiator of peace. The same year, 12 noble cities of Asia were overturned by an earthquake. The ruin happened in the night, and the more dreadful as its warnings were unobserved. Neither availed the usual sanctuary against such calamities, namely a flight to the fields, since those who fled the gaping earth devoured. It is reported that mighty mountains subsided, plains were heaved into high hills, and that with flashes and eruptions of fire the mighty devastation was everywhere accompanied. The Sardians felt most heavily the rage of the concussion, and therefore most compassion. Tiberius promised them 100,000 great sesterces, and remitted their taxes for 5 years. The inhabitants of Magnesia, under Mount Sipylus, were held next in sufferings, and had proportionable relief. The Temnians, Philadelphians, the Egatians, Apollonians, with those called the Mostinians or Macedonians of Hyrcania, the cities too of Hero Caesarea, Myrnia, Syme, and Molus, were all for the same term eased of tribute. It was likewise resolved to send one of the Senate to view the desolations and administer proper remedies. Marcus Alytus was therefore chosen, one of praetorian rank, because a consular senator then governing Asia, had another of the like quality been sent, an emulation between equals was apprehended, and consequently opposition and delays. The credit of this noble bounty to the public he increased by private liberalities which proved equally popular. The estate of the wealthy Emilemusa, claimed by the exchequer as she died intestate, he surrendered to Aemilius Lepidus, to whose family she seemed to belong, as also to Marcus Servilius the inheritance of Potilius, a rich Roman knight, though part of it he had bequeathed to himself. But he found Servilius named sole heir in a former and well-attested will. He said such was the nobility of both that they deserved to be supported. Nor did he ever accept to himself any man's inheritance, but where former friendship gave him a title. The wills of such as were strangers to him, and of such as, from hate and prejudice to others, had appointed the prince their heir, he utterly rejected. But as he relieved the honest poverty of the virtuous, so he degraded from the Senate, or suffered to quit it of their own accord. Vibidius Varro, Marius Nepos, Appius Appianus, Cornelius Sylla, and Quintius Vitellius, all prodigals, and only through debauchery indigent. End of section 22.
Section 23 of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author, edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1. The Annals, Book 2, Part 5. The African Conflicts. About this time Tiberius finished and consecrated what Augustus began, the temples of the gods consumed by age or fire. That near the great circus, vowed by Aulus Postumius, the dictator, to Bacchus, Proserpina, and Ceres, in the same place the temple of Flora, founded by Lucius Publicius and Marcus Publicius, while they were aediles, the temple of Janus, built in the herb market by Caius Duilius, who first signalized the Roman power at sea, and merited a naval triumph over the Carthaginians. That of Hope was dedicated by Germanicus. This temple Attilius had vowed in the same war. The law of violated majesty, in the meantime, waxed intense, and by it an accuser impleaded Apulia Virilia, grand-niece to Augustus, by his sister, for that, with opprobrious words, she had revived the defied Augustus, Tiberius, and his mother, and, being nearly allied to the emperor, had stained by adultery the Caesarian blood. Concerning the adultery, sufficient provision was thought already made by the Julian law, and the crimes of state, Tiberius desired, might be separated. If she had uttered impious speeches of Augustus, she must be condemned. But, for invectives against himself, he would not have called her to any account. The council asked him, what would be his sentiments if she were convicted of defaming his mother? To this he made no answer, but, next sitting of the Senate, he prayed too in her name, that no word spoken against her might to any one be imputed for crimes, and acquitted Apulia of her treason. Of her punishment too for adultery he begged a mitigation, and prevailed that, by the example of our ancestors, she should be removed by a kindred 200 miles from Rome. Manlius, her adulterer, was interdicted Italy and Africa. A debate at this time arose about substituting a praetor in the room of Vipsanius Gallus, removed by death. Germanicus and Drusus, for they were yet at Rome, espoused Haterius Agrippa, kinsman to Germanicus. Many, on the contrary, insisted that the number of children should decide it, and the candidate who had most be preferred, for this was the voice of the law. Tiberius rejoiced to see the Senate engaged in a contention between his sons and the laws. The law, without doubt, was vanquished, yet not instantly and by a small majority, but with the same struggle that laws were vanquished when laws were in force. This year a war began in Africa, conducted by Tacfarinas. He was a native of Numidia, and had served amongst the auxiliaries in the Roman armies, but, deserting the service, gathered together, by the allurements of booty and rapine, at first a herd of vagabonds and men inured to robberies, then formed them, like an army, into regular companies of foot and troops of horse, under distinct standards and colours. At length he was no longer esteemed the leader of a disorderly gang, but considered as general of the Mussylanians. This powerful people, borderers upon the deserts of Africa, still wild and without towns, took arms, and drew into the war the neighbouring Moors. These too had a general of their own, his name Mazeppa, and between the two leaders the army was divided. That, whilst Tacfarinas encamped with the best men, armed after the fashions of Romans, and accustomed then to discipline and command, Mazeppa, with a flying band, might make excursions on every side, with fire, slaughter, and alarms. They had likewise forced the Cynthians into their measures, a nation nowise despicable. When furious Camillus, proconsul of Africa, marched against the enemy with 1 legion, and what troops of the allies were under his command, a handful of men at most, when compared to the multitude of Numidians and Moors. But it was his first care not to intimidate them with numbers, and thence tempt them to elude fighting and prolong the war. Indeed, he gave them hopes of victory, only to enable himself to vanquish them. The legion was placed in the centre, the light cohorts and 2 wings of horse on the right and left. Nor did Tacfarinas decline the combat. The Numidians were routed, and after a long series of years, military renown recovered to the name of Furius. For since Camillus, the restorer of Rome, and his son, the glory of command and victories continued in other families. Even he whom I have mentioned passed for a man destitute of military abilities and experience in war. Hence Tiberius magnified, with the more unfeigned alacrity, his exploits to the Senate, and to him the fathers decreed the ensigns of triumph. Yet to Camillus all the merit and distinction proved to snare, protected as he was by a life singularly modest and retired. The consuls for the following year were Tiberius the 3rd time, Germanicus the 2nd. This dignity overtook Germanicus at Nicopolis, a city of Achaia, whither he arrived, by the coast of Illyricum, from visiting his brother Drusus, then abiding in Dalmatia, and had suffered a tempestuous passage both in the Adriatic and Ionian Sea. He therefore spent a few days to repair his fleet, and viewed the while the Bay of Actium, renowned for the naval victory there, as also the spoils consecrated by Augustus, and the camp of Antony, with an affecting remembrance of these his ancestors. For Antony, as I have said, was his great uncle, Augustus his father. Hence this scene proved to Germanicus a mighty source of images pleasing and sad. Next he proceeded to Athens, where, in concession to that ancient city, allied to Rome, he would use but 1 lictor. The Greeks received him with the most elaborate honours, and, to dignify their personal flattery, carried before him tabulators of the signal deeds and sayings of his ancestors. Hence he sailed to Euboea, then to Lesbos, where Agrippina was delivered of Julia, who proved her last child. Then he kept the coast of Asia, and visited Perinthus and Byzantium, cities of Thrace, and entered the straits of Propontis, and the mouth of the Euxine, fond of beholding ancient places long celebrated by fame. He relieved, at the same time, the provinces wherever distracted with intestine factions, or aggravated with the oppressions of their magistrates. In return he strove to see the religious rites of the Samothracians, but, by the violence of the north wind, was repulsed from the shore as he passed. He saw Troy and her remains, venerable for the vicissitude of her fate, and for the birth of Rome. Regaining the coast of Asia, he pulled in at Colophon, to consult there the oracle of the Clarian Apollo. It is no Pythoness that represents the god here, as at Delphos, but a priest, one chosen from certain families, chiefly of Miletus. Neither requires he more than just to hear the names and numbers of the querists, and then descends into the oracular cave. where, after a draught of water from a secret spring, though ignorant for the most part of letters and poetry, he yet utters his answers in verse, which has for its subject the conceptions and wishes of Cash Consultant. He was even said to have sung to Germanicus his hastening fate, but, as oracles are wont, in terms dark and doubtful. Now Cineas Piso, hurrying to the execution of his purposes, terrified the city of Athens by a tempestuous entry, and reproached them in a severe speech with the bleak censure of Germanicus, that, debasing the dignity of the Roman name, he had paid excessive court, not to the Athenians, by so many slaughterers long since extinct, but to the then mixed scum of nations there. For that these were they who had leagued with Mithridates against Sylla, and with Antony against Augustus. He even charged them with the errors and misfortunes of ancient Athens, her impotent attempts against the Macedonians, her violence and ingratitude to her own citizens. He was also an enemy to their city from personal anger, because they would not pardon at his request one Theophilus, condemned by the Areopagus for forgery. From thence, sailing hastily through the Cyclades, and taking the shortest course, he overtook Germanicus at Rhodes, but was there driven by a sudden tempest upon the rocks. And Germanicus, who was not ignorant with what malignity and invectives he was pursued, yet acted with so much humanity, that, when he might have left him to perish, and referred to casualty the destruction of his enemy, he dispatched galleys to rescue him from the wreck. This generous kindness, however, assuaged not the animosity of Piso. Scarce could he brook a day's delay with Germanicus, but left him in haste to arrive in Syria before him. Nor was he sooner there, and found himself amongst the legions, than he began to court the common men by bounties and caresses, to assist them with his countenance and credit, to form factions, to remove all the ancient centurions, and every tribune of remarkable discipline and severity, and, in their places, to put dependents of his own, or men recommended only by their crimes. He permitted sloth in the camp, licentiousness in the towns, a rambling and disorderly soldiery, and carried the corruption so high, that in the discourses of the herd he was styled Father of the Legions. Nor did Plancina restrain herself to a conduct seemly in her sex, but frequented the exercises of the cavalry, and attended the decursions of the cohorts. Everywhere in weighing against Agrippina, everywhere against Germanicus. And some, even of the most deserving soldiers, became prompt to base obedience, from a rumour whispered abroad, that all this was not unacceptable to Tiberius. These doings were all known to Germanicus, but his more instant care was to visit Armenia, an inconstant and restless nation from the beginning, from the genius of the people as well as from the situation of their country, which, bordering with a large frontier on our provinces, and stretching thence quite to Media, is enclosed between the two great empires, and often at variance with them, with the Romans through antipathy and hatred, with the Parthians through competition and envy. At this time, and ever since the removal of Vonones, they had no king, but the affections of the nations leaned towards Zeno, son of Polemon, king of Pontus, because, by an attachment from his infancy to the fashions and customs of the Armenians, by hunting, feasting, and other usages practised and renowned amongst the barbarians, he had equally won the nobles and people. Upon his head, therefore, at the city of Artaxata, with the approbation of the nobles, in a great assembly, Germanicus put the regal diadem, and the Armenians, doing homage to their king, saluted him Artaxius, a name which from that of their city they gave him. The Cappadocians, at this time reduced into the form of a province, received for their governor Quintus Varinius, and to raise their hopes of the gentler dominion of Rome, several of the royal taxes were lessened. Quintus Servius was set over the Commagenians, then first subjected to the jurisdiction of a praetor. From the affairs of the allies, thus all successfully settled, Germanicus reaped no pleasure, through the perverseness and pride of Piso, who was ordered to lead, by himself or his son, part of the legions into Armenia, but contemptuously neglected to do either. They at last met at Syrian, the winter quarters of the 10th legion, whither each came with a prepared countenance. Piso to betray no fear, and Germanicus would not be thought to threaten. He was indeed, as I have observed, of a humane and reconcilable spirit, but officious friends, expert at inflaming animosities, aggravated real offences, added fictitious, and with manifold imputations charged Piso, Placinia, and their sons. To this interview Germanicus admitted a few intimates, and began his complaints in such words as dissembled resentment usually dictates. Piso replied with disdainful submissions, and they parted in open enmity. Piso hereafter came rarely to the tribunal of Germanicus, or, if he did, sate sternly there and in manifest opposition. He likewise published his spite at a feast of the Nabathæan kings, where golden crowns of great weight were presented to Germanicus and Agrippina, but to Piso and the rest such as were light. This banquet, he said, was made for the son of a Roman prince, not a Parthian monarch. With these words he cast away his crown, and uttered many invectives against luxury. Sharp insults upon Germanicus, yet he bore them. At this time arrived ambassadors from Artabanus, king of the Parthians. He sent them to represent the state of the mutual league and friendship between the two empires, how desirous he was to renew it, that, in honour to Germanicus, he would come to receive him as far as the banks of the Euphrates, and requested, in the meantime, that Vonones might not be continued in Syria, lest, taking the advantage of so near a neighbourhood, he should, by corresponding with the grandees of Parthia, engage in civil dissension and rebellion. The answer given by Germanicus, as far as related to the alliance of the Romans and the Parthians, was conceived in terms of dignity and grandeur, but of the coming of the king and the court and veneration intended to himself, he spoke with becoming complaisance and modesty. Vonones was removed to Pompeiopolis, a maritime city of Cilicia, a concession made, not at the request of Artabanus only, but in contumely to Piso, with whom Vonones was in high favour, for the assiduous court and many presents, by which he had won Plancina. In the consulship of Marcus Silanus and Lucius Norbanus, Germanicus travelled to Egypt, to view the famous antiquities of the country, though for the motives of the journey the care and inspection of the province were publicly alleged, and indeed, by opening the granaries, he mitigated the price of corn, and practised many things grateful to the people. Walking without guards, his feet bare, and his habit the same with that of the Greeks, after the example of Publius Scipio, who, we are told, was constant in the same practices in Sicily, even during the rage of the Punic war there. For these he assumed manners and foreign habit. Tiberius blamed him in a gentle style, but censured him with great asperity for violating an establishment of Augustus, and entering Alexandria without consent of the prince. For Augustus, amongst other secrets of power, had set apart and appropriated Egypt, and restrained the senators and dignified Roman knights from going thither without license. As he apprehended that Italy might be distressed with famine by any who seized that province, the key to the empire by sea and land, and defensible by a light band of men against potent armies, Germanicus, not yet informed that his journey was censured, sailed up the Nile. Beginning at Canopus, one of its mouths, built by the Spartans, as a monument to Canopus, a pilot buried there, at the time when Menelaus, returning to Greece, was driven to different seas in the Liberian continent. Hence he visited the next mouth of the river, sacred to Hercules. Him the natives aver to have been born amongst them, that he was the most ancient of the name, and that all the rest, who with equal virtues followed his example, were in honour called after him. Next he visited the mighty antiquities of ancient Thebes, where upon huge obelisks yet remained Egyptian characters, describing its former opulency. One of the oldest priests was ordered to interpret them. He said they related that it once contained 700,000 fighting men, that with that army King Rameses had conquered Libya, Ethiopia, the Medes and Persians, the Bactrians and Scythians, and to his empire had added the territories of the Syrians, Armenians, and their neighbours the Cappadocians, a tract of countries reaching from the Sea of Bithynia to that of Lycia. Here also was read the assessment of tribute laid on the several nations, what weight of silver and gold, what number of horses and arms, what ivory and perfumes as gift to the temples, what measures of grain, what quantities of all necessaries were by each people paid, revenues equally grand with those extracted by the domination of the Parthians or by the power of the Romans. Germanicus was intent upon seeing other wonders. The chiefs were the effigies of Memnon, a colossus of stone, yielding, when struck by the solar rays, a vocal sound; the pyramids rising, like mountains, amongst rolling and almost impassable waves of sand, proud monuments of the emulation and opulency of Egyptian kings; the artificial lake, a receptacle of the overflowing Nile; and elsewhere abysses of such immense depth that those who tried could never fathom. Thence he proceeded to Elephantina and Syene, two islands, formerly frontiers of the Roman Empire, which is now widened to the Red Sea. While Germanicus spent this summer in several provinces, Drusus was sowing feuds among the Germans, and thence reaped no light reward. And as the power of Merobodas was already broken, he engaged them to persist and complete his ruin. Amongst the Gatonis was a young man of quality, his name Catuelda, a fugitive long since from the violence of Marbodous, but now in his distress resolved on revenge. Hence with a stout hand he entered the borders of the Marcomannians, and, corrupting their chiefs into his alliance, stormed the regal palace and the castle situate near it. In the pillage were found the ancient stores of prey accumulated by the Suevians, as also many victuallers and traders from our provinces, men who were drawn hither from their several homes, first by privilege of traffic, then retained by a passion to multiply gain, and at last, through utter oblivion of their own country, fixed, like natives, in a hostile soil. To Merobodas, on every side forsaken, no other refuge remained but the mercy of Caesar. He therefore passed the Danube, where it washes the province of Norica, and wrote to Tiberius, not however in the language of a fugitive or supplicant, but with a spirit suitable to his late grandeur, that many nations invited him to them, as a king once so glorious, but he preferred to all the friendship or Rome. The emperor answered, that in Italy he should have a safe and honourable retreat, and, when his affairs required his presence, the same security to return. But to the senate he declared, that never had Philip of Macedon been so terrible to the Athenians, nor Pyrrhus, nor Antiochus to the Roman people. The speech is extant. In it he magnifies the greatness of the man, the fierceness and bravery of the nations his subjects, the alarming nearness of such an enemy to Italy, and his own artful measures to destroy him. Maroboduus was kept at Ravenna, for a check and terror to the Suevians, as if, when at any time they grew turbulent, he were there in readiness to recover their subjugation. Yet in 18 years he left not Italy, but grew old in exile there. His renown, too, became eminently diminished. Such was the price he paid for an over-passionate love of life. The same sate had Catualda, and no other sanctuary. He was soon after expulsed by the forces of the Hermundurians, led by Vibullius, and, being received under the Roman protection, was conveyed to Forum Julium, a colony in Narbonne, Gaul. The barbarians, their followers, lest had they been mixed with the provinces, they might have disturbed their present quiet, were placed beyond the Danube, between the rivers Marius and Corsus, and their king had assigned them Vannius, by nation Aquadian. Section 24
of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Graham Redman. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author. Edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1. The Annals, Book 2, Section 6, The Death of Germanicus. As soon as it was known at Rome that Artaxius was by Germanicus given to the Armenians for their king, the fathers decreed to him and Drusus the lesser triumph. Triumphal arches were likewise erected on each side the temple of Mars the Avenger, supporting the statues of these two Caesars. And for Tiberius, he was more joyful to have established peace by policy than if by battles and victories he had ended the war. He therefore also assailed by the ways of craft Rescuporis, a king of Thrace. That whole nation had been subject to Rhemetalces, but upon his death one moiety was by Augustus granted to Rescuporis his brother, and one to Cotys his son. In this partition the vales, cities, and territories bounding upon Greece fell to Cotys. To Rescuporis the wilds, the hills, and the parts exposed to a hostile neighbourhood. The two kings were likewise dissonant in their genius, the former mild and agreeable, the latter cruel, rapacious, and impatient of equality. Yet at first they lived in hollow friendship, but in a while Rescuporis began to break bounds, to seize for himself the portions of Cotys, and, where he met resistance, to exercise violence, cautiously, it is true, and by degrees in the life of Augustus, to whose grant they owed both their kingdoms, and, if his authority had been despised, his vengeance was dreaded. But upon the change of emperors he poured in bands of robbers, demolished forts, and thus sought to provoke war. Tiberius was about no consideration of state so anxious as that things once settled should never after be molested. He instantly dispatched a centurion to the two kings to forbid their proceeding to a decision by arms, and Cotys forthwith dismissed the forces he had raised. Rescuporis feigned submission and desired an interview, for that by treaty, he said, they might adjust all their differences, and upon the time, the place, and even upon the conditions, they quickly agreed, while one through easiness, one through fraud, yielded and accepted every proposition. Rescuperus, for a sanction, as he pretended, to the league, added a banquet, and the festivity and drinking was prolonged till midnight, when Cotys, warm with wine and feasting, and void of circumspection, was suddenly loaded with chains, deprecating in vain the brutal treachery, by the inviolable rights of kings, by the common gods of their family, by that very banquet of sacred pledge of concord and hospitality. Rescuperus, having now seized all Thrace, wrote to Tiberius that bloody snares were contrived for him, but he had anticipated the contriver, and, pretending a war against the Bastanians and Scythians, fortified himself with new forces, horse and foot. He had a soft answer, that if he had practised no guile he might securely trust to his innocence. But neither could he himself nor the Senate, without hearing the cause, distinguish between justice and violence; that therefore, delivering up Cotys, he should come, and upon him effectually transfer the odium of the crime. This letter Latinius Pandus, pro-praetor of Maesia, transmitted to Thrace by the soldiers sent to receive Cotys. Rescuperus, wavering long between fear and rage, determined at last rather to be guilty of a finished than an imperfect villainy. He caused Cotys to be murdered, and belied his death, as if by his own hands it had been procured. Neither yet did Tiberius change his favourite course of dissembling, but upon the death of Pandus, whom Rescuperus alleged to have been his enemy, preferred to the government of Maesia Pomponius Flaccus, an ancient officer, one in close friendship with the king, and by it more qualified to betray him. Hence chiefly he was preferred. Flaccus passed into Thrace, and, though he found him full of hesitation, and revolving with great dismay upon the crying horror of his own wickedness, yet by mighty promises prevailed upon him to enter the Roman barrier. Here the king, on pretence of solemnity and honour, was surrounded with a strong party and a crowd of officers, who pressed him by earnest exhortations and many arguments, and the further they travelled, the more apparent to him was his confinement, so that at last, convinced of the necessity of going, he was by them haled to Rome. He was accused before the Senate by the wife of Cotys, and condemned to exile far from his kingdom. Thrace was divided between Rematalces his son, who, it was manifest, had opposed all his father's outrageous measures, and the sons of Cotys. These were minors, and placed with their kingdom under the administration of Trebellianus Rufus, formerly praetor, after the example of our ancestors, who sent Marcus Lepidus into Egypt in quality of guardian to the children of Ptolemy. Rescuperus was transported to Alexandria, and there slain, attempting flight, or falsely charged with it. At the same time Vonones, who had been removed, as I have above related, into Cilicia, corrupted his keepers, and endeavoured to escape to Armenia, thence to the Albanians and Heniochians, and then to his kinsman the king of Scythia. Thus, pretending to hunt, and avoiding the maritime coasts, he gained the devious recesses of the forests, and then, on a sudden, rode full speed to the river Pyramus. But the countrymen, apprised of the king's flight, had broken the bridges, neither was the stream to be forded. Upon the banks, therefore, of the river he was by Vibius Fronto, general of horse, put in bonds, and presently after, by Remmius, a resumed veteran, lately his keeper, run through, in affected wrath, with a sword. Hence arose the stronger belief that, from consciousness of fraud and dread of discovery, Vonones was slain. Germanicus, returning from Egypt, learned that all his orders left with the legions and the eastern cities were either entirely abolished or contrary regulations established, a ground for his severe resentment and reproaches upon Piso. nor less keen were the efforts and machinations of Piso against Germanicus. Yet Piso afterwards determined to leave Syria, but was detained by the following illness of Germanicus. Again, when he heard of his recovery, and perceived that vows were paid for his restoration, the lictors by his command broke the solemnity, drove away the victims already at the altars, overturned the apparatus of the sacrifice, and scattered the people of Antioch employed in celebrating the festival. He then departed to Seleucia, waiting the event of the malady which had again assaulted Germanicus. His own persuasion, too, that poison was given him by Piso, heightened the cruel vehemence of the disease. Indeed, upon the floors and walls were found fragments of human bodies, the spoils of the grave, with charms and incantations, and the name of Germanicus graved on sheets of lead, carcasses half burnt, besmeared with gore, and other witchcrafts, by which souls are thought doomed to the infernal gods. Besides, there were certain persons, charged as creatures of Piso, purposely sent and employed to watch the progress and efforts of the disease. These things filled Germanicus with apprehensions great as his resentment. If his doors, he said, were besieged, if under the eyes of his enemies he must render up his spirit, what was to be expected to his unhappy wife, what to his infant children? The progress of poison was thought too slow, Piso was impatient, and urging with eagerness to command alone the legions, to possess alone the province, but Germanicus was not sunk to such lowness and impotence that the price of his murder should remain with the murderer. And by a letter to Piso he renounced his friendship. Some add that he commanded him to depart the province, nor did Piso tarry longer, but took ship, yet checked her sailing, in order to return with the more quickness should the death of Germanicus the while leave the government of Syria vacant. Germanicus, after a small revival drooping again, when his end approached, spoke on this wise to his attending friends: "Were I to yield to the destiny of nature, just even then were my complaints against the gods for hurrying me from my parents, my children, and my country by a hasty death in the prime of life. Now, shortened in my course by the malignity of Piso and his wife, to your breasts I commit my last prayers. Tell my father, tell my brother, with what violent persecutions afflicted, with what mortal snares circumvented, I end a most miserable life by death of all others the worst. All they whose hopes in my fortune, all they whose kindred blood, and even they whose envy possess them with impressions about me whilst living, shall bewail me dead, that once great in glory, and surviving so many wars, I fell at last by the dark devices of a woman. To you place will be left to complain in the Senate, place to invoke the aid and vengeance of the laws. To commemorate the dead with slothful wailings is not the principal office of friends. They are to remember his dying wishes, to fulfill his last desires. Even strangers will lament Germanicus. You are my friends. If you loved me rather than my fortune, you will vindicate your friendship. Show the people of Rome my wife, her who is the granddaughter of Augustus, and enumerate to them our offspring, even 6 children. Their compassion will surely attend you who accuse, and the accused, if they pretend clandestine warrants of iniquity, will not be believed, if believed, not pardoned." His friends, as a pledge of their fidelity, touching the hand of the dying prince, swore that they would forego their lives sooner than their revenge. Then, turning to his wife, he besought her that in tenderness to his memory, in tenderness to their common children, she would banish her haughty spirit, yield to her hostile fortune, nor upon her return to Rome by an impotent competition for ruling irritate those who were masters of rule. So much openly, and more in secret, whence he was believed to have warned her of guile and danger from Tiberius. Soon after he expired, to the heavy sorrow of the province and of all the neighbouring countries, insomuch that remote nations and foreign kings were mourners. Such had been his complacency to our confederates, such his humanity to his enemies. Alike venerable he was, whether you saw him or heard him, and without ever departing from the grave port and dignity of his sublime rank, he yet lived destitute of arrogance and untouched by envy. The funeral, which was performed without exterior pomp or a procession of images, drew its solemnity from the loud praises and amiable memory of his virtues. There were those who, from the loveliness of his person, his age, his manner of dying, and even from the proximity of places where both departed, compared him in the circumstances of his fate to the great Alexander. Each of a graceful person, each of illustrious descent, in years neither much exceeding 30, both victims to the malice and machinations of their own people in the midst of foreign nations. But Germanicus, gentle towards his friends, his pleasures moderate, confined to one wife, all his children by one bed, nor less a warrior, though not so rash, however hindered from a final reduction of Germany, broken by him in so many victories and ready for the yoke. So that, had he been sole arbiter of things, had he acted with the sovereignty and title of royalty, he had easier overtaken him in the glory of conquests, as he surpassed him in clemency, in moderation, and in other virtues. His body, before its commitment to the pile, was exhibited naked in the Forum of Antioch, the place where the pile was erected. Whether it bore the marks of poison remained undecided, for people, as they were divided in their affections, as they pitied Germanicus and presumed the guilt of Piso, or were partial to him, gave opposite accounts. It was next debated amongst the legates of the legions and the other senators there, to whom should be committed the administration of Syria, and after the faint efforts of others it was long disputed between Vibius Marsus and Cneius Sentius. Marsus at last yielded to Sentius, the older man and the more vehement competitor. By him one Martina, infamous in that province for practices in poisoning and a close confidant of Plancina, was sent to Rome at the suit of Vitellius, Varanius, and others, who were preparing criminal articles against Piso and Plancina as against persons evidently guilty. Agrippina, though overwhelmed with sorrow, and her body indisposed, yet impatient of all delays to her revenge, embarked with the ashes of Germanicus and her children, attended with universal commiseration. That a lady, in quality a princess, wont to be beheld in her late splendid wedlock with applauses and adorations, was now seen bearing in her bosom her husband's funeral urn, uncertain of vengeance for him and fearful for herself, unfortunate in her fruitfulness, and from so many children obnoxious to so many blows of fortune. Piso, the while, was overtaken at the Isle of Coos by a message that Germanicus was deceased, and received it intemperately, slew victims, and repaired with thanksgivings to the temples. Yet however immoderate and undisguised was his joy, more arrogant and insulting proved that of Plancina, who immediately threw off her mourning, which for the death of a sister she wore, and assumed a dress adapted to gaiety and gladness. About him flocked the centurions with officious representations, that upon him particularly were bent the affections and zeal of the legions, and he should proceed to resume the province, at first injuriously taken from him, and now destitute of a governor. As he therefore consulted what he had best pursue, his son Marcus Piso advised a speedy journey to Rome. Hitherto, he said, nothing past expiation was committed, neither were impotent suspicions to be dreaded, nor the idle blazonings of fame. His variance and contention with Germanicus was, perhaps, subject to popular hate and aversion, but to no prosecution or penalty, and by bereaving him of the province his enemies were gratified. But if he returned thither, as Sentius would certainly oppose him with arms, a civil war would thence be actually begun. Neither would the centurions and soldiers persist in his party, men with whom the recent memory of their late commander and an inveterate love to the Caesars in general were still prevalent. Domitius Celer, one in intimate credit with Piso, argued on the contrary, that the present event must by all means be improved. It was Piso and not Sentius who had commission to govern Syria. Upon him were conferred the jurisdiction of praetor and the badges of magistracy, and with him the legions were entrusted. So that if acts of hostility were by his opponents attempted, with how much better warrant could he avow assuming arms in his own right and defence, who was thus vested with the authority of general, and acted under special orders from the emperor? Rumours, too, were to be neglected and left to perish with time. In truth, to the sallies and violence of recent hate the innocent were often unequal. But were he once possessed of the army, and had well augmented his forces, many things not to be foreseen would from fortune derive success. Are we then preposterously hastening to arrive at Rome with the ashes of Germanicus, that you may there fall, unheard and undefended, a victim to the wailings of Agrippina, a prey to the passionate populace governed by the first impressions of rumour? Livia, it is true, is your confederate, Tiberius is your friend, but both secretly, and indeed none will more pompously bewail the violent fate of Germanicus than such as do most sincerely rejoice for it. Piso, of himself prompt to violent pursuits, was with no great labour persuaded into this opinion, and, in a letter transmitted to Tiberius, accused Germanicus of luxury and pride, that for himself he had been expulsed to leave room for dangerous designs against the state, and now resumed with his former faith and loyalty the care of the army. In the meantime he put Domitius on board a galley, and ordered him to avoid appearing upon the coasts or amongst the isles, but through the main sea to sail to Syria. The deserters, who from all quarters were flocking to him in crowds, he formed into companies, and armed all the retainers to the camp. Then, sailing over to the continent, intercepted a regiment of recruits upon their march into Syria, and wrote to the small kings of Cilicia to assist him with present succours. Nor was the younger Piso slow in prosecuting all the measures of war, though to adventure a war had been against his sentiments and advice. As they coasted Lycia and Pamphylia, they encountered the ships which carried Agrippina, with hostile spirits on each side, and each at first prepared for combat. But as equal dread of one another possessed both, they proceeded not further than mutual contumelies. Vibius Marsus particularly summoned Piso as a criminal to Rome, there to make his defence. He answered with derision that when the praetor who was to sit upon poisonings had assigned a day to the accusers and the accused, he would attend. Domitius, the while, landing at Laodicea, a city of Syria, would have proceeded to the winter quarters of the 6th Legion, which he believed to be the most prone to engage in novel attempts, but was prevented by Pacuvius, its commander. Sentius represented this by letter to Piso, and warned him at his peril to infect the camp by ministers of corruption, or to assail the province by war, and drew into a body such as he knew loved Germanicus, or such as were averse to his foes. Upon them he inculcated with much ardour that Piso was with open arms attacking the majesty of the prince, and invading the Roman state, and then marched at the head of a puissant body, equipped for battle, and resolute to engage. Neither failed Piso, though his enterprises had thus far miscarried, to apply the securest remedies to his present perplexities, and therefore seized a castle of Cilicia strongly fortified, its name Celendris. For to the auxiliary Cilicians sent him by the petty kings he had joined his body of deserters, as also the recruits lately intercepted, with all his own and Plancina's slaves, and thus in number and bulk had of the whole composed a legion. To them he thus harangued: I, who am the lieutenant of Caesar, am yet violently excluded from the province which to me Caesar has committed. Not excluded by the legions, for by their invitation I am arrived, but by Sentius, who thus disguises under feigned crimes against me his own animosity and personal hate. But with confidence you may stand in battle, where the opposite army upon the site of Piso, a commander lately by themselves styled their father, will certainly refuse to fight. They know, too, that were right to decide it, I am the stronger, and of no mean puissance in a trial at arms. He then arrayed his men without the fortifications, on a hill steep and craggy, for all the rest was begirt by the sea. Against them stood the veterans, regularly embattled, and supported with a body of reserve, so that here appeared the force of men, there only the terror and stubbornness of situation. On Piso's side was no spirit, no hope, nor even weapons, save those of rustics, for instant necessity hastily acquired. As soon as they came to blows, the issue was no longer doubtful than while the Roman cohorts struggled up the steep. The Cilicians then fled, and shut themselves up in the castle. Piso, having the while attempted in vain to storm the fleet, which rode at a small distance, as soon as he returned, presented himself upon the walls, where by a succession of passionate complaints and entreaties, now bemoaning in agonies the bitterness of his lot, then calling and cajoling every particular soldier by his name, and by rewards tempting all, he laboured to excite a sedition, and thus much he had already effected, that the eagle-bearer of the 6th Legion revolted to him with his eagle. This alarmed Sentius, and instantly he commanded the cornets and trumpets to sound, a mount to be raised, the ladders placed, and the bravest men to mount, and others to pour from the engines volleys of darts and stones and flaming torches. The obstinacy of Piso was at last vanquished, and he desired that upon delivering his arms he might remain in the castle till the emperor's pleasure, to whom he would commit the government of Syria, were known, conditions which were not accepted, nor was aught granted him save ships and a passport to Rome. After the illness of Germanicus became noised abroad there, and all its circumstances, like rumours magnified by distance, were related with many aggravations, sadness seized the people. They burned with indignation, and even poured out in plaints the anguish of their souls. For this, they said, he had been banished to the extremities of the empire. For this the province of Syria was committed to Piso, and these the fruits of Livia's mysterious conferences with Plancina. Truly had our fathers spoken concerning his father Drusus, that the possessors of rule beheld with an evil eye the popular spirit of their sons, nor for aught else were they sacrificed, but for their equal treatment of the Roman people, and studying to restore the popular state. These lamentations of the populace were, upon the tidings of his death, so inflamed, that without staying for an edict from the magistrates, without a decree of senate, they by general consent assumed a vacation. The public courts were deserted, private houses shut up. Prevalent everywhere were the symptoms of woe, heavy groans, dismal silence. The whole a scene of real sorrow, and nothing devised for form or show. And though they forbore not to bear the exterior marks and habiliments of mourning, in their souls they mourned still deeper. Accidentally some merchants from Syria, who had left Germanicus still alive, brought more joyful news of his condition. These were instantly believed and instantly proclaimed. Each, as fast as they met, informed others, who forthwith conveyed their light information with improvements and accumulated joy to more. All flew with exultation through the city, and, to pay their thanks and vows, burst open the temple doors. The night, too, heightened their credulity, and affirmation was bolder in the dark. Nor did Tiberius restrain the course of these fictions, but left them to vanish with time. Hence with more bitterness they afterwards grieved for him, as if anew snatched from them. Honours were invented and decreed to Germanicus, various as the affections and genius of the particular senators who proposed them. That his name should be sung in the Salian hymns, curule chairs placed for him amongst the priests of Augustus, and over these chairs oaken crowns hung. His statue in ivory proceed in the Circensian games. None but one of the Julian race be in the room of Germanicus created flamen or augur. Triumphal arches were added, one at Rome, one upon the banks of the Rhine, one upon Mount Amanus in Syria, with inscriptions of his exploits, and a testimony subjoined that he died for the commonwealth. A sepulchre at Antioch, where his corpse was burnt. A tribunal at Epidaphne, the place where he ended his life. The multitude of statues, the many places where divine honours were appointed to be paid him, would not be easily recounted. They would have also decreed him, as to one of the masters of eloquence, a golden shield, signal in bulk as in metal. But Tiberius offered to dedicate one himself, such as was usual, and of a like size with others, for that eloquence was not measured by fortune, and it was sufficient glory if he were ranked with ancient writers. The battalion called after the name of the Junii was now, by the equestrian order, entitled the Battalion of Germanicus, and a rule made that on every 15th of July these troops should follow as their standard the effigies of Germanicus. Of these honours many continue, some were instantly omitted, or by time are utterly obliterated. In the height of this public sorrow, Livia, sister to Germanicus and married to Drusus, was delivered of male twins, an event even in middling families rare and acceptable, and to Tiberius such mighty matter of joy that he could not refrain boasting to the fathers that to no Roman of the same eminence before him were ever two children born at a birth. For to his own glory he turned all things, even things fortuitous. But to the people, at such a sad conjuncture, it brought fresh anguish, as they feared that the family of Drusus, thus increased, would press heavily upon that of Germanicus. The same year the lubricity of women was by the Senate restrained with severe laws, and it was provided that no woman should become venal if her father, grandfather, or husband were Roman knights. For Vistilia, a lady born of a Praetorian family, had, before the aediles published herself a prostitute, upon a custom allowed by our ancestors, who thought that prostitutes were, by thus avowing their infamy, sufficiently punished. Titirius Labeo, too, was questioned that in the manifest guilt of his wife he had neglected the punishment prescribed by the law, but he alleged that the 60 days allowed for consultation were not elapsed, and it was deemed sufficient to proceed against Vistilia, who was banished to the Isle of Seriphus. Measures were also taken for exterminating the solemnities of the Jews and Egyptians, and by decree of Senate 4,000 descendants of franchised slaves, all tainted with that superstition, but of proper strength and age, were to be transported to Sardinia to restrain the Sardinian robbers, and if, through the malignity of the climate, they perished, despicable would be the loss. The rest were doomed to depart Italy, unless by a stated day they renounced their profane rites. After this, Tiberius represented that to supply the place of Oxia, who had presided 57 years with the highest sanctimony over the Vestals, another virgin was to be chosen, and thanked Fonteius Agrippa and Asinius Pollio that, by offering their daughters, they contended in good offices towards the commonwealth. Pollio's daughter was preferred, for nothing else but that her mother had ever continued in the same wedlock, for Agrippa, by a divorce, had impaired the credit of his house. Upon her who was postponed, Tiberius in consolation bestowed for her fortune 1,000 great sesterces. As the people murmured at the severe dearth of corn, he settled grain at a price certain to the buyer, and undertook to pay 14 pence a measure to the seller. Neither yet would he accept the name of father of his country, a title offered him before, and for these bounties now again. Nay, he sharply rebuked such as styled these provisions of his divine occupations, and him lord. Hence freedom of speech became cramped and insecure under such a prince, one who dreaded liberty and abhorred flattery. I find in the writers of those times, some of them senators, that in the Senate were read letters from Adgandestrius, prince of the Catians, undertaking to dispatch Arminius if in order to it poison were sent him, and an answer returned that not by frauds and blows in the dark, but armed and in the face of the sun, the Roman people took vengeance on their foes. In this Tiberius gained equal glory with our ancient captains, who rejected and disclosed a plot to poison King Pyrrhus. Arminius, however, who, upon the departure of the Romans and expulsion of Maroboduus, aimed at royalty, became thence engaged in a struggle against the liberty of his country, and in defence of their liberty his countrymen took arms against him, so that while with various fortune he contended with them, he fell by the treachery of his own kindred. The deliverer of Germany without doubt he was, one who assailed the Roman power not like other kings and leaders in its first elements, but in its highest pride and elevation, one sometimes beaten in battle, but never conquered in war. 37 years he lived, 12 he commanded, and amongst these barbarous nations his memory is still celebrated in their songs, though his name be unknown in the annals of the Greeks, who only admire their own national exploits and renown, nor even amongst the Romans does this great captain bear much distinction, while overlooking instances of modern prowess and glory, we only delight to magnify men and feats of old. End of section 24. Section 25 of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Graham Redman. The complete works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author. Edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1. The Annals, Book 3, Part 1. The Disgrace of Piso. Agrippina, notwithstanding the roughness of winter, pursuing without intermission her boisterous voyage, put in at the island Corcyra, situated over against the coasts of Calabria. Here, to settle her spirit, she spent a few days, violent in her grief, and a stranger to patience. Her arrival being the while divulged, all the particular friends to her family, mostly men of the sword, many who had served under Germanicus, and even many strangers from the neighbouring towns, some in officiousness towards the emperor, more for company, crowded to the city of Brundusium, the readiest port in her way, and the safest landing. As soon as the fleet appeared in the deep, instantly were filled not the port alone and adjacent shores, but the walls and roofs, and, as far as the eye would go, filled with the sorrowing multitude. They were consulting one from one how they should receive her landing, whether with universal silence or with some note of acclamation. Nor was it manifest which they would do, when the fleet sailed slowly in, not as usual with joyful sailors and cheerful oars, but all things impressed with the face of sadness. After she descended from the ship, accompanied with her 2 infants, carrying in her bosom the melancholy urn, with her eyes cast steadily down, equal and universal were the groans of the beholders, nor could you distinguish relations from strangers, nor the wailings of men from those of women, unless that the newcomers, who were recent in their sallies of grief, exceeded Agrippina's attendants, wearied out with long lamentations. Unless that the newcomers, who were recent in their sallies of grief, exceeded Agrippina's attendants, wearied out with long lamentations. Tiberius had dispatched 2 praetorian cohorts, with directions that the magistrates of Calabria, Apulia, and Campania should pay their last offices to the memory of his son. Upon the shoulders, therefore, of the tribunes and centurions his ashes were borne. Before went the ensigns rough and unadorned, with the fasces reversed. As they passed through the colonies, the populace were in black, the knights in purple, and each place, according to its wealth, burnt precious raiment, perfumes, and whatever else is used in funeral solemnities. Even they whose cities lay remote attended. To the gods of the dead they slew victims, they erected altars, and with tears and united lamentations testified their common sorrow. Drusus came as far as Terracina, with Claudius the brother of Germanicus, and those of his children who had been left at Rome. The consuls Marcus Valerius and Marcus Aurelius just then entered upon their office. The Senate and great part of the people filled the road, a scattered procession, each walking and weeping his own way. In this mourning flattery had no share, for all knew how real was the joy, how hollow the grief of Tiberius for the death of Germanicus. Tiberius and Livia avoided appearing abroad. Public lamentation they thought below their grandeur, or perhaps they apprehended that their countenances, examined by all eyes, might show deceitful hearts. That Antonia, mother to the deceased, bore any part in the funeral, I do not find either in the historians or in the city journals, though besides Agrippina and Drusus and Claudius, his other relations are likewise there recorded by name. Whether by sickness she was prevented, or whether her soul, vanquished by sorrow, could not bear the representation of such a mighty calamity. I would rather believe her to have been constrained by Tiberius and Livia, who left not the palace, and affecting equal affliction with her, would have it seem that by the example of the mother, the grandmother too and uncle were detained. The day when his remains were reposited in the tomb of Augustus, various were the symptoms of public grief. Now an awful silence, then an uproar of lamentation, the city in every quarter full of processions, the field of Mars in a blaze of torches. Here the soldiers under arms, the magistrates without the insignia, the people by their tribes, all cried in concert that the Commonwealth was fallen, and henceforth there was no remain of hope, so openly and boldly that you would have believed they had forgot who bore sway. But nothing pierced Tiberius more than the ardent affections of the people towards Agrippina, while they gave her such titles as the ornament of her country, the only blood of Augustus, the single instance of ancient virtue. And while applying to heaven they implored the continuance of her issue, that they might survive the persecuting and malignant. There were those who missed the pomp of a public funeral, and compared with this the superior honours and magnificence bestowed by Augustus on that of Drusus, the father of Germanicus, that he himself had travelled in the sharpness of winter as far as Pavia, and thence, continuing by the corpse, had with it entered the city. Round his head were placed the images of the Claudii and Julii. He was mourned in the Forum, his encomium pronounced in the rostras. All sorts of honours, such as were the inventions of our ancestors, or the improvements of their posterity, were heaped upon him. But to Germanicus were denied the ordinary solemnities, and such as were due to every distinguished Roman. In a foreign country, indeed, his corpse, because of the long journey, was burnt without pomp, but afterwards it was but just to have supplied the scantiness of the first ceremony by the solemnity of the last. His brother met him but 1 day's journey, his uncle not even at the gate. Where were those generous observances of the ancients, the effigies of the dead borne on a bed, hymns composed in memory of their virtue, with the oblations of praises and tears? Where, at least, were the ceremonies, and even outside of sorrow? All this was known to Tiberius, and to suppress the discourses of the populace he published an edict that many illustrious Romans had died for the Commonwealth, but none so vehemently lamented. This, however, was to the glory of himself and of all men, if a measure were observed. The same things which became private families and small states became not princes and an imperial people. Fresh grief indeed required vent and ease by lamentation, but it was now time to recover and fortify their minds. Thus the deified Julius upon the loss of an only daughter, thus the deified Augustus upon the hasty death of his grandsons, had both vanquished their sorrow. More ancient examples were unnecessary. How often the Roman people sustained with constancy the slaughter of their armies, the death of their generals, and entire destruction of their noblest families. Princes were mortal, the Commonwealth was eternal. They should therefore resume their several vocations. And because the Megalensian games were at hand, he added that they should even apply to the usual festivities. The vacation ended, public affairs were resumed. Drusus departed for the army in Illyricum, and the minds of all men were bent upon seeing vengeance done upon Piso. They repeated their resentments, that while he wandered over the delightful countries of Asia and Greece, he was stifling by contumacious and deceitful delays the evidences of his crimes, for it was bruited abroad that Martina, she who was famous for poisonings, and sent, as I have above related, by Cneius Sentius towards Rome, was suddenly dead at Brundusium, that poison lay concealed in a knot of her hair, but upon her body were found no symptoms of self-murder. Piso, sending forward his son to Rome with instructions how to soften the emperor, proceeded himself to Drusus. Him he hoped to find less rigid for the death of a brother than favourable for the removal of a rival. Tiberius, to make show of a spirit perfectly unbiased, received the young man graciously, and honoured him with the presents usually bestowed on young noblemen. The answer of Drusus to Piso was that if the current rumours were true, he stood in the first place of grief and revenge, but he hoped they were false and chimerical, and that the death of Germanicus would be pernicious to none. This he declared in public, and avoided all privacy. Nor was it doubted, but the answer was dictated by Tiberius, when a youth otherwise easy and unwary practised thus the wiles and cunning of age. Piso, having crossed the sea of Dalmatia, and left his ships at Ancona, took first the road of Picenum, and then the Flaminian way, following the legion which was going from Pannonia to Rome, and thence to garrison in Africa. This too became the subject of popular censure, that he officiously mixed with the soldiers, and courted them in their march and quarters. He therefore, to avoid suspicion, or because when men are in dread their conduct wavers, did at Narnae embark upon the Nar, and then sailed into the Tiber. By landing at the burying place of the Caesars, he heightened the wrath of the populace. Besides, he and Plancina came ashore in open day, in the face of the city, who were crowding the banks, and proceeded with gay countenances, he attended by a long band of clients, she by a train of ladies. There were yet other provocations to hatred. The situation of his house, proudly overlooking the Forum, and adorned and illuminated as for a festival, the banquet and rejoicings held in it, all as public as the place. The next day Fulcinius Trio arraigned Piso before the consuls, but was opposed by Vitellius, Veranius, and others who had accompanied Germanicus. They said that in this prosecution Trio had no part, nor did they themselves act as accusers, but only gathered materials, and as witnesses produced the last injunctions of Germanicus. Trio dropped that accusation, but got leave to call in question his former life. And now the emperor was desired to undertake the trial, a request which the accused did not at all oppose, dreading the inclinations of the people and senate. He knew Tiberius, on the contrary, resolute in despising popular rumours, and in guilt confederate with his mother, besides that truth and misrepresentations were easiest distinguished by a single judge, but in assemblies odium and envy often prevailed. Tiberius was aware of the weight of the trial, and with what reproaches he was assaulted. Admitting, therefore, a few confidents, he heard the charge of the accusers, as also the apology of the accused, and left the cause entire to the senate. Drusus returned the while from Illyricum, and though the senate had for the reduction of Maroboduus and other his exploits the summer before decreed him the triumph of ovation, he postponed the honour, and privately entered the city. Piso, for his advocates, desired Titus Aruntius, Fulcinius, Asinius Gallus, Assaninus Marcellus, and Sextus Pompeius. But they all framed different excuses, and he had in their room Marcus Lepidus, Lucius Piso, Livineus Regulus. Now earnest were the expectations of all men, how great would prove the fidelity of the friends of Germanicus, what the assurance of the criminal, what the behaviour of Tiberius, whether he would sufficiently smother or betray his sentiments. He never had a more anxious part, neither did the people ever indulge themselves in such secret murmurs against their emperor, nor harbour in silence severer suspicions. When the Senate met, Tiberius made a speech full of laboured moderation, that Piso had been his father's lieutenant and friend, and lately appointed by himself, at the direction of the Senate, coadjutor to Germanicus in administering the affairs of the East. Whether he had there by contumacy and opposition exasperated the young prince, and exulted over his death, or wickedly procured it, they were then to judge with minds unprejudiced. For if he who was the lieutenant of my son violated the limits of his commission, cast off obedience to his general, and even rejoiced at his decease and at my affliction, I will detest the man, I will banish him from my house, and for domestic injuries exert domestic revenge, not the revenge of an emperor. But for you, if his guilt of any man's death whatsoever be discovered, show your just vengeance, and by it satisfy yourselves, satisfy the children of Germanicus, and us his father and grandmother. Consider too especially whether he vitiated the discipline and promoted sedition in the army, whether he sought to debauch the affections of the soldiers and to recover the province by arms, or whether these allegations are not published falsely and with aggravations by the accusers, with whose over-passionate zeal I am justly offended. For whither tended the stripping the corpse and exposing it to the eyes and examination of the populace, with what view was it proclaimed even to foreign nations that his death was the effect of poison, if all this was still doubtful, and remains yet to be tried? It is true I bewail my son, and shall ever bewail him, but neither do I hinder the accused to do what in him lies to manifest his innocence, even at the expense of Germanicus, if aught blameable was in him. From you I entreat the same impartiality. Let not the connection of my sorrow with this cause mislead you to take crimes for proved, because they are imputed. For Piso, if the tenderness of kinsmen, if the faith of friends has furnished him with patrons, let them aid him in his peril, show their utmost eloquence, and exert their best diligence. To the same pains, to the same firmness I exhort the accusers. Thus much out of the common course we will grant to the memory of Germanicus, that the inquest concerning his death be held rather here than in the Forum, in the Senate than in the common tribunals. In all the rest we will descend to the ordinary methods. Let no man in this cause consider Drusus's tears, let none regard my sorrow, no more than the probable fictions of calumny against us. 2 days were then appointed for maintaining the charge, 6 for preparing the defence, and 3 for making it. Fulcinius began with things stale and impertinent, about the ambition and rapine of Piso in his administration of Spain, things which, though proved, brought him under no penalty, if acquitted of the present charge. Nor, though he had been cleared of former faults, could he escape the load of greater enormities. After him Servius, Verenius, and Vitellius, all with equal zeal, but Vitellius with great eloquence, urged that Piso, in hatred to Germanicus and passionate for innovations, had by tolerating general licentiousness and the oppression of the allies, corrupted the common soldiers to that degree that by the most profligate he was styled father of the legions. He had, on the contrary, been outrageous to the best men, above all to the friends and companions of Germanicus, and at last by witchcraft and poison destroyed Germanicus himself, hence the infernal charms and immolations practised by him and Plancina. He had then attacked the commonwealth with open arms, and before he could be brought to be tried, they were forced to fight and defeat him. In every article but one his defence was faltering, for neither his dangerous intrigues in debauching the soldiery, nor his abandoning the province to the most profligate and rapacious, nor even his insults to Germanicus were to be denied. He seemed only to wipe off the charge of poison, a charge which in truth was not sufficiently corroborated by the accusers, since they had only to allege that at an entertainment of Germanicus Piso, while he sat above him, with his hands poisoned the meat. It appeared absurd that amongst so many attending slaves besides his own, in so great a presence and under the eye of Germanicus, he would attempt it. He himself required that the waiters might be racked, and offered to the rack his own domestics. But the judges were implacable from different motives: Tiberius for the war raised in the province, and the Senate could never be convinced that the death of Germanicus was not the effect of fraud. Some moved for the letters written to Piso from Rome, a motion opposed by Tiberius no less than by Piso. From without at the same time were heard the cries of the people that if he escaped the judgment of the Senate, they would with their own hands destroy him. They had already dragged his statues to the place from whence malefactors were precipitated, and there had broken them, but by the orders of Tiberius they were rescued and replaced. Piso was put into a litter and carried back by a tribune of a praetorian cohort, and attendants variously understood whether that officer was intended as a guard for his safety or a minister of death. Plancina was under equal public hatred, but had more secret favour. Hence it was doubted how far Tiberius durst proceed against her. For herself, while her husband's hopes were yet plausible, she professed that she would accompany his fortune, whatever it were, and if he fell, fall with him. But when, by the secret solicitations of Livia, she had secured her own pardon, she began by degrees to drop her husband, and to make a separate defence. After this fatal warning, he doubted whether he should make any further efforts, but, by the advice of his sons, fortifying his mind, he again entered the Senate. There he found the prosecution renewed, suffered the declared indignation of the fathers, and saw all things cross and terrible, but nothing so much daunted him as to behold Tiberius, without mercy, without wrath, close, dark, unmovable, and bent against every access of tenderness. When he was brought home, as if he were preparing for his further defence the next day, he wrote somewhat, which he sealed and delivered to his freedmen. He then washed and anointed, and took the usual care of his person. Late in the night, his wife leaving the chamber, he ordered the door to be shut, and was found at break of day with his throat cut, his sword lying by him. I remember to have heard from ancient men that in the hands of Piso was frequently seen a bundle of writings, which he did not expose, but which, as his friends constantly averred, contained the letters of Tiberius and his cruel orders towards Germanicus, that he resolved to lay them before the fathers and to charge the emperor, but was deluded by the hollow promises of Sejanus, and that neither did Piso die by his own hands, but by those of an express and private executioner. I dare affirm neither, nor yet ought I to conceal the relations of such as still lived when I was a youth. Tiberius, with an assumed air of sadness, complained in the Senate that Piso by that sort of death had aimed to load him with obloquy, and asked many questions, how he had passed his last day, how his last night. The freedman answered to most with prudence, to some in confusion. The emperor then recited the letter sent him by Piso. It was conceived almost in these words: "Oppressed by a combination of my enemies and the imputation of false crimes, since no place is left here to truth and my innocence, to the immortal gods I appeal, that towards you, Caesar, I have lived with sincere faith, nor towards your mother with less reverence. For my sons I implore her protection and yours. My son Cneius had no share in my late management, whatever it were, since all the while he abode at Rome. My son Marcus dissuaded me from returning to Syria. Oh, that, old as I am, I had yielded to him, rather than he, young as he is, to me. Hence more passionately I pray that, innocent as he is, he suffer not in the punishment of my guilt. By a series of services for 45 years I entreat you, by our former fellowship in the consulship, by the memory of the deified Augustus, your father, by his friendship to me, by mine to you, I entreat you for the life and fortune of my unhappy son. It is the last request which I shall ever make you." Of Plancina he said nothing. Tiberius, upon this, cleared the young man of any crime as to the civil war. He alleged the orders of his father which a son could not disobey. He likewise bewailed that noble house and even the grievous lot of Piso himself, however deserved. For Plancina he pleaded with shame and guilt, alleging the importunity of his mother, against whom more particularly the secret murmurs of the best people waxed bitter and poignant. Was it then the tender part of a grandmother to admit to her sight the murderess of her grandson, to be intimate with her, and to snatch her from the vengeance of the Senate? To Germanicus alone was denied what by the laws was granted to every citizen. By Vitellius and Veranius the cause of that prince was mourned and pleaded. By the emperor and his mother Plancina was defended and protected. Henceforth she might pursue her infernal arts, so successfully tried, repeat her poisonings, and by her arts and poisons assail Agrippina and her children, and, with the blood of that most miserable house, satiate the worthy grandmother and uncle. In this mock trial 2 days were wasted, Tiberius all the while animating the sons of Piso to defend their mother. When the pleaders and witnesses had vigorously pushed the charge, and no reply was made, commiseration prevailed over hatred. The consul Aurelius Cotta was first asked his opinion, for when the emperor collected the voices, the magistrates likewise voted. Cotta's sentence was that the name of Piso should be razed from the annals, part of his estate forfeited, part granted to his son Cneius, upon changing that name. His son Marcus should be divested of his dignity, and, content with 50,000 great sesterces, be banished for 10 years. And to Plancina, at the request of Livia, indemnity should be granted. Much of this sentence was abated by the emperor, particularly that of striking Piso's name out of the annals, when that of Mark Antony, who made war upon his country, that of Jullus Antonius, who had by adultery violated the house of Augustus, continued still there. He also exempted Marcus Piso from the ignominy of degradation, and left him his whole paternal inheritance, for, as I have already often observed, he was incorruptible by any temptations of money, and from the shame of having acquitted Plancina, rendered then more than usually mild. He likewise withstood the motion of Valerius Messallinus for erecting a golden statue in the temple of Mars the Avenger, and that of Caecina Severus for founding an altar to revenge. Such monuments as these, he argued, were only fit to be raised upon foreign victories. Domestic evils were to be buried in sadness. Messallinus had added that to Tiberius, Livia, Antonia, Agrippina, and Drusus public thanks were to be rendered for having revenged the death of Germanicus, but had omitted to mention Claudius. Messallinus was asked by Lucius Asprenas in the presence of the Senate whether by design he had omitted him, and then at last the name of Claudius was subjoined. To me, the more I revolve the events of late or of old, the more of mockery and slipperiness appears in all human wisdom and the transactions of men. For in popular fame, in the hopes, wishes, and veneration of the public, all men were rather destined to the empire than he for whom fortune then reserved the sovereignty in the dark. End of section 25.
Section 26 of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Claude Banta. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author. Edited and translated by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1. The Annals, Book 3, Part 2. The Disgrace of Piso. A few days after, Vitellius, Varanius, and Severus were by the Senate preferred to the honors of the priesthood at the motion of Tiberius. To Volsinius he promised his interest in suffrage towards preferment, but advised him not to embarrass his eloquence by impetuosity. This was the end of revenging the death of Germanicus, an affair ambiguously related, not by those only who then lived and interested themselves in it, but likewise in following times. So dark and intricate are all the highest transactions, while some hold for certain facts the most precarious hearsays, others turn facts into falsehood, and both are swallowed and improved by the credulity of posterity. Drusus went now without the city, there to renew the ceremony of the auspices, and presently re-entered in the triumph of ovation. A few days after died Vespania his mother, of all the children of Agrippa, the only one who made a pacific end. The rest manifestly perished, or are believed to have perished, by the sword, poison, and famine. The same year, Tacfarinas, whom I have mentioned to have been the former summer defeated by Camillus, renewed the war in Africa, first by roving devastations, so sudden that they escaped unchastised. Next he sacked towns, and bore away mighty plunder. At last he begirt a Roman cohort, a small distance from the river Pagida. It was a fort commanded by Decrius, a brave soldier, exercised in war, and now touched with the ignominy of such a siege. Encouraging therefore his men to offer open battle, he drew them up without the walls. At the first shock the cohort was repulsed, but the resolute Decrius braved the enemy's darts, opposed the runaways, and upbraided the standard-bearers, that upon vagabonds and undisciplined robbers the Roman soldiers turned their backs. He had already received several wounds, and his eye was beat out, but still faced the foe, nor ceased fighting, till, wholly deserted by his men, he at last was slain. Lucius Apronius had succeeded Camillus. As soon as he learnt this defeat, piqued rather by the infamy of his own men than by the glory of the enemy, he practised an exemplary severity, at this time rare, but agreeable to ancient discipline, by executing with a club every 10th man of that ignominious cohort, drawn by lot. Such too was the effect of this rigor, that those very forces of Tacfarinas, as they besieged the fortress of Thala, were routed by a squadron of 500 veterans. In this battle, Rufus Helvius, a common soldier, acquired the glory of saving a citizen, and was, by Apronius, presented with the spear and collar. Tiberius added the civic crown, complaining, rather than resenting, that Apronius had not, in right of proconsul, granted that also. Tacfarinas, now his Numidians were dismayed, and bent against sieges, made a desultory war, flying when attacked, and upon a retreat assaulting the rear. As long as the African observed this method, he, with impunity to himself, mocked and harassed the Romans. But after he drew down to the maritime places, the allurements and quantities of plunder confined him to his camp. Hither Apronius Caesanius was by his father dispatched with the cavalry and auxiliary cohorts, to which was added a detachment of the best legionary foot, and, having successfully fought the Numidians, drove them back to the deserts. At Rome the while, Aemilia Lepida, who, besides the nobleness of the Aemilian family, was great-granddaughter to Pompey and Sylla, was charged with imposing a false birth upon Publius Cornelius her husband, a man rich and childless. The charge was swelled with adulterex, poisonings, and treasonable dealings with the Chaldeans about the fate and continuance of the imperial house. Her brother Manius Lepidus defended her, and, guilty and infamous as she was, the persecution from her husband, continued after their divorce, drew compassion upon her. In the trial it was no easy matter to discover the heart of Tiberius. With such subtlety he mixed and shifted the symptoms of indignation and clemency. At first he besought the Senate not to meddle with the articles of treason, and presently engaged Marcus Servilius, once consul, and the other witnesses, to produce the very evidences of treason, which he would have appeared desirous to suppress. Yet he took the slaves of Lepida from the guard of soldiers, and surrendered them to the consuls. Nor would he suffer them to be examined by torture, as to her practised against himself. He even excused Drusus from voting first as consul-elect. This some understood as an instance of complaisance, that the rest might not be obliged to follow the example of Drusus. Some ascribe it to cruelty, for that only with design to have her condemned that concession was made. The public games interrupted the trial, and in the recess Lepida, accompanied with other ladies of great quality, entered the theatre. There, with doleful lamentations, invoking her illustrious ancestors, especially the great Pompey, whose statues stood round in view, the theatre itself a monument of his raising, she excited such universal commiseration that the spectators burst into tears, and, uttering cruel and direful imprecations against Cornelius, declared their indignation, that to his childless old age and mean blood should be given a lady once designed for the wife of Lucius Caesar, and for the daughter-in-law of the deified Augustus. At last, by racking her slaves, her crimes were made manifest, and the judgment of Rubellius Blondus prevailed for interdicting her from fire and water. To this judgment Drusus assented, though others had proposed a milder. That her estate should not be forfeited was granted to Scaurus, who by her had had a daughter. And now, after condemnation, Tiberius advertised the Senate, that, from the slaves too of Cornelius, he had learnt her attempts to poison him. As a consolation to the illustrious families of Rome for their late calamities, for the Calpurnian house had suffered the loss of Piso, and just after the Aemilian house that of Lepida, Decius Silanus was now restored to the Junian family. I will briefly recite his disgrace, as against the Republic the fortune of Augustus was prevalent, so in his family it was unhappy, by the lewdness of his daughter and granddaughter, whom he turned out of Rome, and with death or exile punished their adulterers. For to a fault common between men and women he gave the heinous name of sacrilege and treason, and thence had a color for departing from the tenderness of our ancestors, and for violating his own laws. But I shall hereafter relate the fate of others from this his severity, as also the other transactions of that time, if having finished my present undertaking, life remains for other studies. Silenus, who had vitiated the granddaughter of Augustus, though he felt no higher indignation than to be excluded from the friendship and presence of the emperor, yet understood this as a denunciation of banishment. Nor durst he, till the reign of Tiberius, supplicate the prince and senate for leave to return, and then only trusted to the prevailing credit of his brother Marcus Silanus, distinguished by his illustrious quality and eminent for his great eloquence. Marcus, having returned thanks to Tiberius, had this answer before the senate, that he himself also rejoiced that his brother was returned from travels so long and remote, that his return home was perfectly unexceptionable, since neither by decree of senate nor by any sentence of law had he been driven thence. That to himself, however, still remained entire the resentment of his father towards him, nor by the return of Silanus were the purposes of Augustus violated. Thenceforward he remained in Rome, but distinguished by no preferment in the state. The qualifying of the law Papia Poppaea was afterwards proposed, a law which, to enforce those of Julius Caesar, Augustus had made when he was old, for punishing celibacy and enriching the exchequer. Nor even by this means had marriages and children multiplied, while a passion to live single and childless still prevailed. But in the meantime the numbers threatened, and in danger by it, increased daily, while by the glosses and chicanery of the impleaders every family was undone. So that, as before the city labored under the weight of crimes, so now under the pest of laws. From this thought I am led backwards to the first rise of laws, and to open the steps and causes by which we are arrived to the present number and excess, a number infinite and perplexed. The first race of men, free as yet from every depraved passion, lived without guile and crimes, and therefore without chastisements and restraints. Nor was there occasion for rewards, when of their own accord they pursued righteousness, and as they courted nothing contrary to justice, they were debarred from nothing by terrors. But after they had abandoned their original equality, and from modesty and shame to do evil, proceeded to ambition and violence, lordly dominion was introduced, and arbitrary rule, and in many nations grew perpetual. Some, either from the beginning, or after they were surfeited with kings, preferred the sovereignty of laws, which, agreeably to the artless minds of men, were at first short and simple. The laws in most renown were those framed for the Cretians by Minos, for the Spartans by Lycurgus, and afterwards such as Solon delivered to the Athenians, now greater in number and more exquisitely composed. To the Romans justice was administered by Romulus, according to his pleasure. After him Numa managed the people by religious devices and laws divine. Some institutions were made by Tullius Hostilius, some by Ancus Martinus, but above all our laws were those founded by Servius Tullius, such laws as even our kings were bound to obey. Upon the expulsion of Tarquin, the people, for the security of their freedom against the encroachment and factions of the Senate, and for binding the public concord, prepared many ordinances. Hence were created the Decemviri, and by them were composed the 12 Tables, out of a collection of the most excellent institutions found abroad. This was the period of all upright and impartial laws. What laws followed, though sometimes made against crimes and offenders, were yet chiefly made by violence, through the animosity of the two estates, and for seizing unjustly withholden offices, or for banishing illustrious patriots and to other wicked ends. hence the Gracchi and Saturni, inflamers of the people, and hence Livius Drusus vying on behalf of the Senate in popular concessions with these inflamers, whence our Italian allies were first corrupted and animated with fair promises, then by the opposition of other demagogues disappointed and deceived. Neither during the war of Italy nor during the civil war was the making of regulations discontinued. Many and contradictory were even then made. At last Sylla the dictator, changing or abolishing the past, added many of his own, and procured some respite in this matter, but not long, for presently followed the turbulent pursuits and proposals of Lepidus, and soon after were the tribunes restored to their licentious authority of throwing the people into combustions at pleasure. And now laws were not made for the public only, but for particular men particular laws, and, corruption abounding in the commonwealth abounded in laws. Pompey was now, in his third consulship, chosen to correct the public enormities, and his remedies proved to the state more grievous than its distempers. He made laws such as suited his ambition, and broke them when they thwarted his will, and lost by arms the regulations which by arms he had procured. Henceforward for 20 years civil discord raged, and there was neither law nor settlement. The most wicked found impunity in the excess of their wickedness, and many virtuous men in their uprightness met destruction. At length Augustus Caesar, in his sixth consulship, then confirmed in power without a rival, abolished the orders which during the triumvirate he had established, and gave us laws proper for peace and a single ruler. These laws had sanctions severer than any heretofore known. As their guardians, informers were appointed, who by the law Papia Popea were encouraged with rewards to watch such as neglected the privileges annexed to marriage and fatherhood, and consequently could claim no legacy or inheritance, the same as vacant belonging to the Roman people, who were the public parent. But these informers struck much deeper. By them the whole city, all Italy, and the Roman citizens in every part of the empire were infested and persecuted. Numbers were stripped of their entire fortunes, and terror had seized all, when Tiberius, for a check to this evil, chose 20 noblemen, 5 who were formerly consuls, 5 who were formerly praetors, with 10 other senators, to review that law. By them many of its intricacies were explained, its strictness qualified, and hence some present alleviation was yielded. Tiberius about this time recommended to the Senate Nero, one of the sons of Germanicus, now 17 years of age, and desired that he might be exempted from executing the office of the Vigintiferate, and have leave to sue for the quaestorship 5 years sooner than the laws directed. A piece of mockery this request to all who heard it, but Tiberius pretended that the same concessions had been decreed to himself and his brother Drusus at the request of Augustus. Nor do I doubt but there were then such who secretly ridiculed that sort of petitions from Augustus. Such policy was however natural to that prince, then laying the foundations of the imperial power, and while the republic and its laws were still fresh in the minds of men. Besides, the relation was lighter between the Augustus and his wife's sons than between a grandfather and his grandsons. To the grant of the quaestorship was added a seat in the college of pontiffs, and the first day he entered the forum in his manly robe, a donative of corn and money was distributed to the populace, who exulted to behold the son of Germanicus, now of age. Their joy was soon heightened by his marriage with Julia, the daughter of Drusus. But as these transactions were attended with public applauses, so the intended marriage of the daughter of Sejanus with the son of Claudius was received with popular indignation. By this alliance the nobility of the Claudian house seemed stained, and by it Sejanus, already suspected of aspiring views, was exalted still higher. At the end of this year died 2 great and eminent men, Lucius Volusius and Sallustius Crispus. The family of Volusius was ancient, but, in the exercise of public office, rose never higher than the praetorship. It was he who honored it with the consulship. He was likewise created censor, for modeling the classes of the equestrian order, and first accumulated the wealth which raised that family beyond all measure. Crispus was born of an equestrian house, great-nephew by a sister to Caius Sallustius, the renowned Roman historian, and by him adopted. The way to the great offices was open to him, but, in imitation of Maecenas, he lived without the dignity of senator, yet outwent in power many who were distinguished with consulships and triumphs. His manner of living, his dress and daintiness, were different from the ways of antiquity, and in expense and affluence he bordered rather upon luxury. He possessed, however, a vigor of spirit equal to great affairs, and exerted the greater promptness, for that he hid it in a shoe of indolence and sloth. He was, therefore, in the lifetime of Maecenas, the next in favor, afterwards chief confidant, in all the secret councils of Augustus and Tiberius, and assenting to the order for slaying Agrippa Posthumus. In his old age he preserved with the prince rather the outside than the vitals of authority. The same had happened to Maecenas. Such is the lot of power, rarely perpetual, perhaps from satiety on both sides, when princes have no more to grant, and ministers no more to crave. Next followed the consulship of Tiberius and Drusus, to Tiberius the fourth, to Drusus the second. A consulship remarkable, for that in it the father and son were colleagues. There was indeed the same fellowship between Tiberius and Germanicus 2 years before, but besides the distastes of jealousy in the uncle, the ties of blood were not so near. In the beginning of the year, Tiberius, on pretence of his health, retired to Campania, either already meditating a long and perpetual retirement, or to leave to Drusus, in his father's absence, the honor of executing the consulship alone. And there happened a thing, which, small in itself, yet as it produced mighty contestation, furnished the young consul with matter of popular affection. Domitius Corbulo, formerly praetor, complained to the Senate of Lucius Sylla, a noble youth, that in the shoe of gladiators Sylla would not yield him place. Age, domestic custom, and the ancient men were for Corbulo. Mamercus Scaurus, Lucius Aruntius, and others labored for their kinsman Sylla. Warm speeches were made, and the examples of our ancestors were urged, who by severe decrees and censured and restrained the irreverence of youth. Drusus interposed with arguments proper for calming animosities, and Corbulo had satisfaction made him by Scaurus, who was both father-in-law and uncle to Sylla, and the most copious orator of that age. The same Corbulo, exclaiming against the condition of most of the roads through Italy, that through the fraud of the undertakers and negligence of the civil officers they were broken and unpassable, undertook of his own accord the cure of that abuse, an undertaking which he executed, not so much to the advantage of the public as to the ruin of many private men in their fortunes and reputation, by his violent mulcts and unjust judgments and forfeitures. Soon after, Tiberius by letter acquainted the Senate that by the incursions of Tacfarinas there were fresh commotions in Africa, and that they must choose a proconsul, one of military experience, vigorous and equal to that war. Sextus Pompeius, taking this occasion to discharge his hate against Marcus Lepidus, reproached him as dastardly indigent, a scandal to his ancestors, and therefore to be divested even of the government of Asia, his province by lot. The Senate opposed him. They thought Lepidus a man rather mild than slothful, and that, as in his narrow fortune bequeathed to him, but not impaired by him, he supported his quality without blemish, he merited honor rather than contumely. He was therefore sent to Asia. Concerning Africa, it was decreed that the appointment of a governor should be left to the emperor. During these transactions, Caecina Severus proposed that no magistrate should go into any province accompanied by his wife. He introduced this motion with a long preface, that he lived with his own in perfect concord. By her he had 6 children, and what he offered to the public he had practised himself, having, during 40 years' service, left her still behind him, confined to Italy. It was not indeed without cause, established of old, that women should neither be carried by their husbands into confederate nations, nor into foreign. A train of women introduced luxury and peace, by their fears retarded war, and made a Roman army resemble, in their march, a mixed host of barbarians. The sex was not tender only and unfit for travel, but if suffered, cruel and aspiring, and greedy of authority. They even marched amongst the soldiers, and were obeyed by the officers. A woman had lately presided at the exercises of the troops, and at the decursions of the legions. The Senate themselves might remember that as often as many of the magistrates were charged with plundering the provinces, their wives were always charged with much guilt. To the ladies, the most profligate in the province ever applied. By them all affairs were undertaken, by them transacted. At home 2 distinct courts were kept, and abroad the wife had her distinct train and attendants. The ladies, too, issued distinct orders, but more imperious and better obeyed. Such feminine excesses were formerly restrained by the Oppian and other laws, but now these restraints were violated. Women ruled all things, their families, the forum and tribunals, and even the armies. This speech was heard by few with approbation, and many proclaimed their dissent, for that neither was that the point in debate, nor was Caecina considerable enough to censure so weighty an affair. He was presently answered by Valerius Messallinus, who was the son of Messalla, and inherited a sparkling of his father's eloquence, that many rigorous institutions of the ancients were softened and changed for the better, for neither was Rome now, as of old, beset with wars, nor Italy with hostile provinces. Hence a few concessions were made to the conveniences of women, who were so far from burdening the provinces, that to their own husbands there they were no burden. As to honours, attendance, and expense, they enjoyed them in common with their husbands, who could receive no embarrassment from their company in time of peace. To war indeed we must go equipped and unencumbered, but after the fatigues of war, what was more allowable than the consolations of a wife? But it seemed the wives of some magistrates had given a loose to ambition and avarice, and were the magistrates themselves free from these excesses? Were not most of them governed by many exorbitant appetites? Did we therefore send none into the provinces? It was added that the husbands were corrupted by their corrupt wives. Were therefore all single men uncorrupt? The Oppian laws were once thought necessary, because the exigencies of the state required their severity. They were afterwards relaxed and mollified, because that too was expedient for the state. In vain we covered our own sloth with borrowed names. If the wife broke bounds, the husband ought to bear the blame. It was, moreover, unjustly judged for the weak and uxorious spirit of one or a few to bereave all others of the fellowship of their wives, the natural partners of their prosperity and distress. Besides, the sex, weak by nature, would be left defenceless, exposed to the luxurious bent of their native passions and to the seduction of adulterers. Scarce under the eye and restraint of the husband was the marriage bed preserved inviolate. What must be the consequence when, by an absence of many years, the ties of marriage would be forgot as it were in a divorce? It became them therefore so to cure the evils abroad as not to forget the enormities at Rome. To this Drusus added somewhat concerning his own wedlock. Princes, he said, were frequently obliged to visit the remote parts of the empire. How often did the deified Augustus travel to the east? How often to the west, still accompanied with Livia? He himself too had taken a progress to Illyricum, and, if it were expedient, was ready to visit other nations, but not always with an easy spirit, if he were to be torn from his dear wife, her by whom he had so many children. Thus was Caecina's motion eluded. When the Senate met next, they had a letter from Tiberius. In it he affected indirectly to chide the fathers, that upon whom they cast all public cares, and named them M. Lepidus and Junius Blsesus, to choose either for proconsul of Africa. They were then both heard as to this nomination, and Lepidus excused himself with earnestness, pleaded his bodily frailty, the tender age of his children, and a daughter fit for marriage. There was another reason too, of which he said nothing, but it was easily understood, even that Blsesus was uncle to Sejanus, and therefore had the prevailing interest. Blsesus too made a shew of refusing, but not with a like positiveness, and moreover was heard with partiality by the flatterers of power. Now at last broke out a grievance which had lain hitherto smothered in the uneasy minds of men. The statues of the emperor were become sanctuaries to every profligate, who, by laying hold of these statues, had assumed the insolence of venting with impunity their invectives and hatred against worthy men. Even slaves and freedmen were thence grown terrible to their masters, and wantonly insulted and threatened them. Against this abuse it was argued by Caius Cestius the senator, that princes were indeed the representatives of the gods, but by the gods just petitions only were heard, nor did any one betake himself to the Capitol, or to the other temples of Rome, that under their sacred shelter he might exercise villainies. The laws were abolished and finally overturned, if a criminal convict could, in the public forum, nay, at the door of the Senate, assault her prosecutor with invectives and menaces. Yet thus had Aeneia Rufila assaulted him, she whom he had got judicially condemned for forgery, neither durst he seek relief from the law, for that she protected herself with the emperor's statue. Much the same reasoning was offered by others. Some aggravated the offence with greater bitterness, and besought Drusus to shew an exemplary instance of vengeance, so that she was summoned, convicted of the charge, and by his command committed to the common prison. Considius Ecus too and Silius Cursor, Roman knights, were at the motion of Drusus punished by a decree of Senate for forging a charge of treason against the praetor Magius Caecilianus. From this their punishment and that of Rufila, Drusus reaped popular praise, that by him, living thus sociably at Rome, and frequenting the public assemblies, the dark spirit and designs of his father were softened. Neither did the luxury in which the young prince lived give much offence. Let him, it was said, be rather thus employed, his days in shews and acts of popularity, his nights in banqueting, than in dismal solitude, withdrawn from public gaiety, worried with incessant distrusts, and fostering black designs. For neither was Tiberius nor the impleaders yet tired with accusations. Oncarius Priscus had accused Caesius Cordus, proconsul of Crete, of robbing the public, with an additional charge of high treason, a charge which at the time was the main bulwark of all accusations. Antistius Vetus, a nobleman of the first rank in Macedonia, had been tried for adultery and absolved. This offended Tiberius, who reproached the judges and recalled him to be tried for treason, as a disturber of the public and confederate with the late king Rescuporis, when having slain his brother Cotis, he meditated war against us, so that Vetus was condemned and interdicted from fire and water. To this sentence it was added, that he should be confined to an island, neither in the neighborhood of Macedon nor of Thrace, For upon the division of that kingdom between Rhametocles and the sons of Cotys, who being children had for their guardian Trebellinus Rufus, the Thracians, not used to our government, waxed discontented and tumultuous, nor did they less censure Rhametocles than Trebellinus, for leaving unpunished the violences done them. The Colatians, Odrysians, and other very powerful nations took arms under distinct captains, but all equal in meanness and incapacity. For this reason their armies were not united, nor the war terrible. Some committed ravages at home, others traversed Mount Haemus to engage in the insurrection in the distant provinces. The greatest part and best appointed besieged Philippopolis, a city founded by Philip of Macedon, and in it King Rhametocles. Publius Vilius, who commanded the army in the neighboring province, when he heard of these commotions, dispatched parties of horse and light foot, some against those who roamed about for plunder, some against such as rambled from place to place to solicit succors. He himself led the body of the infantry to raise the siege. These several enterprises were at once successfully executed. The rovers were cut off, divisions arose amongst the besiegers, and the king fortunately sallied, just as the Roman forces arrived. This gang of Thracians deserve not the name of an army, nor this rout to be called a battle, where vagabonds, half armed, were slaughtered, without blood on our side. End of section 26.
Introduction to the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Father Ziley of Detroit, Michigan. Recorded November 2007. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author, edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1, The Annals, Book 3, Part 3, Tiberius Pleads with the Senate. The same year the cities of Gaul, stimulated by their excessive debts, began a rebellion. The most vehement incendiaries were Julius Florus and Julius Sacrover, the first amongst those of Treves, the second amongst the Edwins. They were both of distinguished nobility, both descended from ancestors who had done signal services to the Roman state, and thence acquired of old the right of Roman citizens, a privilege rare in those days, and only the prize of virtue. When by secret meetings they had gained those who were most prompt to rebel, with such as were desperate enough through indigence, or from guilt of past crimes, forced to commit more, they agreed that Florus should begin the insurrection in Belgia, Sacrover among the neighboring Gauls. They therefore had many consultations and cabals, where they spared no topic of sedition, quotes open, their tribute without end, their devouring usury, the pride and cruelty of their governors, the discord that had seized the Roman soldiery since the report of the murder of Germanicus, a glorious conjecture for redeeming their liberty, if they would only consider their own happiness and strength, while Italy was poor and exhausted, the Roman populace weak and unwarlike, the Roman armies destitute of all vigor but that derived from foreigners." Unquote. Scarce one city remained untainted with the seeds of this rebellion. But it first broke out at Angiers and Tours. The former were reduced by Achillius Aviola, a legate, with the assistance of a cohort drawn from the garrison at Lyons. Those of Tours were suppressed by the same Aviola, assisted with a detachment sent from the legions by Vicelius Varro, lieutenant governor of Lower Germany. Some of the chiefs of the Gauls had likewise joined him with succors, the better to disguise their defection, and to push it with more effect hereafter. Even Sacrover was beheld engaged in fight for the Romans, with his head bare, a demonstration, he pretended, of his bravery, but the prisoners averred, quotes open, that he did it to be known to his countrymen, and to escape their darts, An account of all this was laid before Tiberius, who slighted it, and by hesitation fostered the war. Florus the while pushed his designs, and tried to persuade a regiment of horse levied at Treves, and kept under our pay and discipline, to begin the war, by putting to the sword the Roman merchants, and some few were corrupted by him, but the body remained in their allegiance. A rabble, however, of his followers and desperate debtors took arms, and were making to the forest of Arden, when the legions, sent from both armies by Vitellius and Caecilius through different routes to intercept them, marred their march. Julius Indus too, one of the same country with Florus, at enmity with him, and therefore more eager to engage him, was dispatched forward with a chosen band, and broke the ill-appointed multitude. Florus, by lurking from place to place, frustrated the search of the conquerors. At last, when he saw all the passes beset with soldiers, he fell by his own hands. This was the issue of the insurrection at Treves. Amongst the Aeduans the revolt was much stronger, as the state was more opulent, and the forces to suppress it were to be brought from afar. Augustodunum, the capital of the nation, was seized by Sacriver, and in it all the noble youth of Gaul, who were there instructed in the liberal arts. By securing these pledges, he aimed to bind in his interest their parents and relations, and at the same time distributed to the young men the arms which he had caused to be secretly made. He had 40,000 men, the fifth part armed like our legions, the rest with poles, hangers, and other weapons used by hunters. To the number were added such of the slaves as had been appointed to be gladiators, covered after the fashion of the country, with a continued armor of iron, and styled crupellarii, a sort of militia, unwieldy at exercising their own weapons, and impenetrable by those of others. These forces were still increased by volunteers from the neighboring cities, where, though the public body did not hitherto avow the revolt, yet the zeal of particulars was manifest. They had likewise leisure to increase from the contention of the two Roman generals, a contention for some time undecided, while each demanded the command in that war. At length Varro, old and infirm, yielded to the superior vigor of Silius. Now at Rome, not only the insurrection of Treves and that of the Aeduans, but likewise that 64 cities of Gaul had revolted, that the Germans had joined in the revolt, and that Spain fluctuated, were reports, all believed with the usual aggravations of fame. The best men grieved in sympathy for their country, many from hatred of the present government, and thirst of change, rejoiced in their own perils. They inveighed against Tiberius, that in such a mighty uproar of rebellion he was only employed in perusing the informations of the state accusers. They asked, did he mean to surrender Julius Sacriver to the Senate, to try him for treason? They exulted, that there were at last found men who would with arms restrain his bloody letters to the Senate, continually demanding condemnations and executions, and declared, that even war was a happy change for a most wretched and calamitous peace, So much the more for this, Tiberius affected to appear wrapped up in security and unconcern. He neither changed place nor countenance, but behaved himself at that time as at other times, whether from elevation of mind, or whether he had learnt that the state of things was not alarming, and only heightened by vulgar representation. Silius, while sending forward a band of auxiliaries, marched with 2 legions, and ravaged the villages of the Sequanians, next neighbors to the Aeduans, and their associates in arms. He then advanced towards Augustodunum, a hasty march, the standard-bearers mutually vying in expedition, and the common men breathing ardor and eagerness, that no time might be wasted even in the usual refreshments, none of their nights in sleep. Let them only see and confront the foe. They wanted no more to be victorious. 12 miles from Augustodunum, Sacrovir appeared with his forces upon the plains. In the front he had placed the iron troop, his cohorts in the wings, the half-armed in the rear, he himself upon a fine horse, attended by the other chiefs, addressing himself to them from rank to rank, reminded them, quotes open, of the glorious achievements of the ancient Gauls, of the victorious mischiefs they had brought upon the Romans, of the liberty and renown attending victory, of their redoubled and intolerable servitude, if once more vanquished. Quotes closed. A short speech and disheartened audience. 4. The embattled legions approached, and the crowd of townsmen, ill-appointed and novices in war, stood astonished, bereft of the present use of eyes and hearing. On the other side, Silius, though he presumed the victory, and thence might have spared exhortations, yet called to his men, quotes open, that they might be with reason ashamed, that they, the conquerors of Germany, should be thus led against a rabble of Gauls as against an equal enemy. One cohort had newly defeated the rebels of Tours, one regiment of horse those of Treves. A handful of this very army had routed the Sequanians. The present Eduans, the more they abound in wealth, the more they wallow in voluptuousness, are so much the more soft and unwarlike. This is what you are now to prove, and your task to prevent their escape. Quotes closed. His words were returned with a mighty cry. Instantly the horse surrounded the foe, the foot attacked their front, and the wings were presently routed. The iron band gave some short obstruction, as the bars of their coats withstood the strokes of sword and pike. But the soldiers had recourse to their hatchets and pickaxes, and, as if they had battered a wall, hewed their bodies and armor. Others with clubs and some with forks beat down the helpless lumps, who, as they lay stretched along, without one struggle to rise, were left for dead. Sacrovir fled first to Augustodunum, thence fearful of being surrendered, to a neighboring town, accompanied by his most faithful adherents. There he slew himself, and the rest one another, having first set the town on fire, by which they were all consumed. Now at last Tiberius wrote to the Senate about this war, and at once acquainted them with its rise and conclusion, neither aggravating facts nor lessening them, but added, quotes open, that it was conducted by the fidelity and bravery of his lieutenants, guided by his counsels, unquote. Quotes closed. He likewise assigned the reasons why neither he nor Drusus went to that war, quotes open, that the empire was an immense body, and it became not the dignity of a prince, upon the revolt of one or two communities, to desert the capital, whence motion was derived to the whole. But now, since he could not be thought conducted by any dread of those nations, he would take a progress to visit and settle them. Quotes closed. The Senate decreed vows and supplications for his return, with other customary honors. Only Cornelius Dolabella, while he strove to outdo others, fell into ridiculous sycophancy by proposing, quotes open, that returning from Campania he should enter Rome through the triumph of ovation. Quotes closed. This occasioned a letter from Tiberius, in which he declared, quotes open, that he was not so destitute of glory, that after having in his youth subdued the fiercest nations, and enjoyed or slighted so many triumphs, he should now in his old age seek empty honors from a short progress about the suburbs of Rome. Quotes closed. About the same time he desired of the Senate that, quotes open, the corps of Sulpicius Quirinius might be distinguished with a public funeral. Quotes closed. Quirinus was born at Lanuvium, a municipal town, and nowise related to the ancient patrician family of the Sulpitii, but, being a brave soldier, was for his vigorous military services to Augustus rewarded with the consulship, and soon after with a triumph for driving the Hominades out of their strongholds in Cilicia. Next, when the young Caius Caesar was sent to settle the affairs of Armenia, Quirinius was appointed his governor, and at the same time paid all court to Tiberius, then in his retirement at Rhodes. This the emperor represented now to the Senate, extolled the kind offices of Quirinius, and branded Marcus Lollius as the author of the perverse behavior of Caius Caesar to himself, and of all the jarring between them. In other instances, the memory of Quirinius was not acceptable to the Senate, for his deadly persecution against Lepida, above recited, and for his prevailing power and avarice in his old age. At the end of the year, Caius Lutorius Priscus, a Roman knight, who had composed a celebrated poem bewailing the death of Germanicus, and received a reward from Tiberius, was attacked by an informer. His charge was, quotes open, that during an illness of Drusus he had composed another, which, if the distemper proved mortal, he hoped to publish with a reward still greater. Quotes closed. This poem Lutorius had, in the fullness of vanity and ostentation, rehearsed at the house of Publius Petronius, in the presence of Vitellia, mother-in-law to Petronius, and of other ladies of quality, who were all summoned by the impleader, and all, except Vitellia, were terrified into a confession. She alone persisted that she had heard nothing. But the evidence tending to destroy him had most credit, and it was the sentence of Haterius Agrippa, consul-elect, that death should be his punishment. This was opposed by M. Lepidus, who spoke on this wise, quotes open, Conscript fathers, if we only regard with what abominable effusions Lutorius Priscus has defiled his own soul and the ears of men, neither dungeon nor rope, nor indeed the punishments peculiar to slaves are sufficient for him. But though wickedness and enormities abound without measure, yet since in coercions and penalties we must observe the limits set by the moderation of the prince, set by precedents made by our ancestors and yourselves, and since we must distinguish the vanity of the head from the malignity of the heart, and words from evil doings, there is room left for a middle judgment, by which neither his offense need escape unpunished, nor we repent of our tenderness or severity. I have often heard our prince complain, when any criminal had, by a desperate death, prevented his mercy. The life of Lutorius is still untouched. To save it will no wise endanger the state, nor will the taking it away have any influence upon others. His studies, as they are full of wildness, are likewise empty and perishing. Neither is aught important or terrible to be apprehended from one who thus betrays his own follies, and makes his court not to the minds of men, but to the imaginations of women. Let him, however, be expelled Rome, interdicted from fire and water, and his estate be forfeited, which judgment of mine is the same as if he were charged with high treason. Quotes closed. Of all the consulars, only Rubellius Blandus assented to this opinion of Lepidus. The rest voted with Agrippa. Priscus was led to the dungeon, and instantly put to death. Tiberius, in a letter to the Senate, descanted upon the proceeding with his usual doubles and ambiguities, magnified, quotes open, their tenderness and zeal in avenging thus with severity even such slight injuries done to the prince, quotes closed, entreated them, quotes open, not to be sudden in punishing for words, quotes closed. He praised Lepidus and censured not Agrippa. Hence an order was made, quotes open, that the decrees of Senate should not in less than 10 days be carried to the exchequer, and to the condemned so much time should be granted, quotes closed. But to the Senate remained no liberty of revisal or annulling, nor was Tiberius ever softened by time. Caius Sulpicius and Decimus Haterius were the following consuls. Their year was exempt from disturbances abroad, but at home some severe blow was apprehended against luxury, which prevailed monstrously in all things that create a profusion of money. But as the more pernicious articles of expense were covered by concealing their prices, therefore from the excesses of the table, which were become the common subject of daily animadversion, apprehensions were raised of some rigid correction from a prince who observed himself the ancient parsimony. For Caius Bibulus having begun the complaint, the other aediles took it up, and argued, quotes open, that the sumptuary laws were despised, the pomp and expense of plate and entertainments, in spite of restraints, increased daily, and by moderate penalties were not to be stopped. Quotes closed. This grievance, thus represented to the Senate, was then referred entire to the emperor. Tiberius, having long weighed with himself whether such an abandoned propensity to prodigality could be stemmed, whether the stemming it would not bring heavier evils upon the public, how dishonorable it would be to attempt what could not be effected, or at least effected by the disgrace of the nobility, and by the subjecting illustrious men to infamous punishments, wrote at last to the Senate in this manner. Quotes open. In other matters, conscript fathers, perhaps it might be more expedient for you to consult me in the Senate, and for me to declare there what I judge for the public weal. But in the debate of this affair it was best that my eyes were withdrawn, lest, while you mark countenances and terror of particulars charged with scandalous luxury, I too should have observed them, and, as it were, caught them in it. Had the vigilant aediles first asked counsel of me, I know not whether I should not have advised them rather to have passed by potent and inveterate corruptions, than only make it manifest what enormities are an overmatch for us. But they, in truth, have done their duty, as I would have all other magistrates fulfill theirs. But for myself, it is neither commendable to be silent, nor does it belong to my station to speak out, since I neither bear the character of an aedile, nor of a praetor, nor of a consul. Something still greater and higher is required of a prince. Every one is ready to assume to himself the credit of whatever is well done, while upon the prince alone are thrown the miscarriages of all. But what is it that I am first to prohibit? What excess retrench to the ancient standard? Am I to begin with that of our country seats, spacious without bounds, and with the number of domestics, a number distributed into nations in private families, or with the quantity of plate, silver, and gold, or with pictures, and the works and statues of brass, the wonders of art, or with the gorgeous vestments promiscuously worn by men and women, or with what is peculiar to the women, those precious stones, for the purchase of which our coin is carried into foreign and hostile nations? I am not ignorant that at entertainments and in conversations these excesses are censured, and a regulation is required. Yet if an equal law were made, if equal penalties were prescribed, these very censures would loudly complain that the state was utterly overturned, that snares and destruction were prepared for every illustrious house, that no man could be guiltless, and all men would be the prey of informers. And yet bodily diseases grow inveterate, and strengthened by time, cannot be checked but by medicines rigid and violent. It is the same with the soul. The sick and raging soul, itself corrupted and scattering its corruption, is not to be qualified by remedies equally strong with its own flaming lusts. So many laws made by our ancestors, so many added by the deified Augustus, the former being lost in oblivion, and, which is more heinous, the latter in contempt, have only served to render luxury more secure. When we covet a thing yet unforbidden, we are apt to fear that it may be forbidden. But when once we can with impunity and defiance overleap prohibited bounds, there remain afterwards nor fear nor shame. How therefore did parsimony prevail of old? It was because every one was a law to himself. It was because we were then only masters of one city, nor afterwards, while our dominion was confined only to Italy, had we found the same instigations to voluptuousness. By foreign conquests we learned to waste the property of others, and in the civil war to consume our own. What a mighty matter is it that the aediles remonstrate, how little to be weighed in the balance with others! It is wonderful that nobody represents, that Italy is in constant want of foreign supplies, that the lives of the Roman people are daily at the mercy of uncertain seas and of tempests, were it not for our opponents from the provinces, supports by which the masters and their slaves and their estates are maintained. Would our own groves and villas maintain us? This care, therefore, conscript fathers, is the business of the prince, and by the neglect of this care, the foundations of the state would be dissolved. The cure of other defects depends upon our own private spirits. Some of us shame will reclaim, necessity will mend the poor, satiety the rich, or if any of the magistrates, from a confidence of his own firmness and perseverance, will undertake to stem the progress of so great an evil, he has both my praises and my acknowledgment that he discharges me of part of my fatigues. But if such will only impede corruptions, and when they have gained the glory, would leave upon me the indignation of their own raising, believe me, conscript fathers, I am not fond of bearing resentments. I already suffer many for the commonwealth, many that are grievous, and almost all unjust, and therefore with reason I intent that I may not be loaded with such as are wantonly and vainly raised, and promise no advantage to you nor to me. Quotes closed. The Senate, upon reading the emperor's letter, released the aediles from this pursuit, and the luxury of the table, which, from the battle of Actium till the revolution made by Galba, flowed for the space of 100 years in all profusion, at last gradually declined. The causes of this change are worth knowing. Formerly the great families, signal for nobility or for riches, were carried away with a passion for magnificence. For in those days it was allowed to court the good graces of the Roman people, with the favor of kings and confederate nations, and to be courted by them, so that each was distinguished by the luster of popularity and dependences in proportion to his affluence, the splendor of his house, and the figure which he made. But after imperial fury had for some time raged in the slaughter of the grandees, and great reputation brought sure destruction, the rest grew wiser. Besides, new men frequently chosen senators from the municipal towns, from the colonies, and even from the provinces, brought with them their own domestic parsimony. And though by fortune or industry many of them grew wealthy as they grew old, yet their former frugal spirit continued. But above all, Vespasian proved the promoter of moderation and frugality, being himself the pattern of ancient economy in his person and table. Hence the compliance of the public with the manners of the prince, and an emulation to practice them, an incitement more prevalent than the terrors of laws and all their penalties. Or perhaps all human things go a certain round. As there are revolutions of time, there are also vicissitudes in manners. No, indeed, have our ancestors excelled us in all these things. Our own age has produced many excellencies worthy of praise and the imitation of posterity. Let us still preserve this strife in virtue with our forefathers. Tiberius, having gained the fame of moderation, because, by rejecting the profit for reforming luxury, he had disarmed the growing hopes of the accusers, wrote to the Senate to desire the tribunitial power for Drusus. Augustus had devised this title as best suiting the supreme power, while avoiding the odious name of king or dictator. Yet he wanted some particular appellation under it to control all powers in the state. He afterwards assumed Marcus Agrippa into fellowship in it, and upon his death Tiberius, that none might doubt who was to be his successor. By this means he conceived he should defeat the aspiring views of others. Besides, he confided in the moderation of Tiberius, and in the mightiness of his own authority. By his example, Tiberius now advanced Drusus into a participation of the supreme majesty, whereas, while Germanicus yet lived, he acted without distinction towards both. In the beginning of his letter, he besought the Greeks, quotes open, that by his counsels the republic might prosper, quotes closed, then added a modest testimony concerning the qualities and behavior of the young prince, without aggravation or false embellishments, quotes open, that he had a wife and 3 children, and was of the same age with himself when called by the deified Augustus to that office, that Drusus was not now by him adopted a partner in the toils of government, precipitately, but after 8 years' experience made of his qualifications, after sedition suppressed, wars concluded, the honor of triumph, and 2 consulships. Quotes closed. The senators had foreseen this address. Hence they received it with the more elaborate adulation. However, they could devise nothing to decree, but, quotes open, statues to the 2 princes, altars to the 2 gods, triumphal arches, quotes closed, and other usual honors, only that Marcus Silanus strove to honor the princes by the disgrace of the consulship. He proposed, quotes open, that all records, public and private, should for their date be inscribed no more with the names of the consuls, but of those who exercised the tribunitial power, quotes closed. But Haterius Agrippa, by moving to have, quotes open, the decrees of that day engraved in letters of gold and hung up in the Senate, quotes closed, became an object of derision, for that, as he was an ancient man, he could reap from his most abominable flattery no other fruit but that of infamy. End of section 27 of Tacitus, The Annals, Book 3, Part 3.
Section 28 of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author, edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1. The Annals, Book 3, Part 4. International Relations under Tiberius. In the meantime, as the province of Africa was continued to Junius Blisus, Servius Melagionensis, the priest of Jupiter, demanded that of Asia. He insisted that it was vainly alleged that such priests were not allowed to leave Italy, that he was under no other restrictions than that of Mars and Romulus, and that, if they were admitted to the lots of provinces, why were those of Jupiter debarred? The same was neither adjudged by the authority of the people, nor in the books which assert the sacred rights. Frequently, when the priests of Jupiter were detained by sickness, or engaged in the public, their function was supplied by the pontiffs. The function itself lay unfilled for 72 years together, after the death of Cornelius Merula, and yet the exercise of religion never ceased. Now, if in such a series of years religion could subsist unhurt without the creation of any such priest at all, how much easier might his absence be borne in the exercise of the proconsular power for 1 year? It was to satiate private piques, if formerly the priests of Jupiter were by the chief pontiffs debarred from the government of provinces. But now, by the goodness of the gods, the chief pontiff was also the chief of men, a pontiff to whom emulation, hatred, and other personal prepossessions had no access. To these his reasonings several answers were made by Lentulus, the augur, and others, but all disagreeing, so that the result was to wait for the decision of the supreme pontiff. Tiberius, in his answer to the Senate, postponing his notice of the pretensions of the priest of Jupiter, qualified the honors decreed to Drusus with the tribunitial power, and especially censured the extravagance of the proposition for golden letters, as contrary to the example and usage of Rome. Letters from Drusus were likewise read, and though modest in expression, were construed to be full of haughtiness. Were all things in the Roman state so miserably reversed, that even a youth, one just distinguished with such supreme honor, deigned not to visit the gods of Rome, nor appear in the Senate, nor begin, in his native city, the auspices of his dignity? No war detained him, he had no journey to make from remote countries, while he was only diverting himself upon the lakes and shores of Campania, and pleasure his chief avocation. With such tuition was he prepared the future ruler of humankind, that this lesson he had himself learned from the maxims of his father. In truth, the emperor himself, an ancient man, might find uneasiness in living under the eye of the public, and plead a life already fatigued with age and occupations. But what, besides pride and stateliness, could obstruct Drusus? Tiberius, while he fortified the vitals of his own domination, afforded the Senate a shadow of their ancient jurisdiction, by referring to their examination petitions and claims from the provinces. For there had now prevailed amongst the Greek cities a latitude of instituting sanctuaries at pleasure. Hence the temples were filled with the most profligate fugitive slaves. Here debtors found protection against their creditors, and hither were admitted such as were pursued for capital crimes. Nor was any authority found sufficient to bridle the seditious zeal of the people, thus defending the villainies of men, as if the same were the sacred institutions of the deities. It was therefore ordered that these cities should send deputies to represent their claims. Some voluntarily relinquished the privileges which they had arbitrarily assumed. Many confided in their right, from the antiquity of their superstitions, or their service to the Roman people. Glorious to the Senate was the appearance of that day, when the grants from our ancestors, the engagements of our confederates, the ordinances of kings, such kings who had reigned as independent of the Roman power, and even when the institutions sacred to the gods were now all subjugated to their inspection, and their judgment free, as of old, to ratify or abolish with absolute power. First of all, the Ephesians applied, and alleged that Diana and Apollo were not born at Delos, according to the opinion of the vulgar. In their territory flowed the river Cenchrus, where also stood the Ortygian grove. There the big-bellied Latana, leaning upon an olive tree, which even then remained, was delivered of these deities, and thence, by their appointment, the grove became sacred. Thither Apollo himself, after his slaughter of the Cyclops, retired for a sanctuary from the wrath of Jupiter. Soon after, the victorious Bacchus pardoned the suppliant Amazons, who sought refuge at the altar of Diana. By the concession of Hercules, when he reigned in Lydia, her temple was dignified with an augmentation of immunities, nor during the Persian monarchy were they abridged. They were next maintained by the Macedonians, and then by us. The Magnesians next asserted their claim, founded on an establishment of Lucius Scipio, confirmed by another of Sylla, the former after the defeat of Antiochus, the latter after that of Mithridates, having, as a testimony of the faith and bravery of the Magnesians, dignified their temple of the Leucophrynian Diana with the privileges of an inviolable sanctuary. After them, the Aphrodisians and Stratocynesians produced a grant from Caesar the dictator for their early services to his party, and another lately from Augustus, with a commendation inserted that, with zeal unshaken towards the Roman people, they had borne the eruptions of the Parthians. But these two people adored different deities. Aphrodisium was a city devoted to Venus. That of Stratonicia maintained the worship of Jupiter and of Diana Trivia. Those of Hieros Caesarea exhibited claims of higher antiquity, that they possessed the Persian Diana, and her temple consecrated by King Cyrus. They likewise pleaded the authorities of Perpenna, Isauricus, and of many more Roman captains, who had allowed the same sacred immunity, not to the temple only, but to the precinct 2 miles around it. Those of Cyprus pleaded right of sanctuary to 3 of their temples, the most ancient founded by Arius, to the Paphian Venus, another by his son Amathus to the Amathusian Venus, the third to the Salamian Jupiter by Teucer, the son of Telamon, after he fled from the fury of his father. The deputies too of the other cities were heard, but the Senate, tired with so many, and because there was a contention begun amongst particular parties for particular cities, gave power to the consuls to search into the validity of their several pretensions, and whether in them no fraud was interwoven, with orders to lay the whole matter once more before the Senate. The consuls reported that, besides the cities already mentioned, they had found the temple of Aesculapius at Pergamos to be a genuine sanctuary. The rest claimed upon originals from the darkness of antiquity, although obscure, Smyrna particularly pleaded an oracle of Apollo, in obedience to which they had dedicated a temple to Venus Stratonicis, as did the Isle of Tanos, an oracular order from the same god, to erect to Neptune a statue and temple. Sardis urged a later authority, namely a grant from the great Alexander, and Miletus insisted on one from King Darius. As to the deities of these two cities, one worshipped Diana, and the other Apollo, and Crete too demanded the privilege of sanctuary to a statue of the deified Augustus. Hence, divers orders of the Senate were made, by which, though great reverence was expressed towards the deities, yet the extent of the sanctuaries was limited, and the several people were enjoined to hang up in each temple the present decree, engraven in brass, as a sacred memorial and a restraint against their lapsing, under the color of religion, into claims of superstition and preeminence. At the same time, a vehement distemper having seized Livia, obliged the emperor to hasten his return to Rome. Seeing the mother and son lived hitherto in apparent unanimity, or perhaps mutually disguised their hate, for, not long before, Livia, having dedicated a statue to the deified Augustus near the theatre of Marcellus, had the name of Tiberius inscribed after her own. This he was believed to have resented heinously, as degrading the dignity of the prince, but to have smothered his resentment under dark dissimulation. Upon this occasion, therefore, the Senate decreed supplications to the gods, with the celebration of the greater Roman games, under the direction of the Pontiffs, the Augurs, the College of 15, assisted by the College of 7, and the fraternity of Augustal priests. Lucius Apronius had moved that, with the rest, might persuade the company of heralds. Tiberius opposed it, and distinguished between the jurisdiction of the priests and theirs, for that at no time had the heralds arrived to so much preeminence, but for the Augustal fraternity they were therefore added, because they exercised a priesthood peculiar to that family for which the present vows and solemnities were made. It is no part of my purpose to trace all the votes of particular men, unless they are memorable for integrity, or for notorious infamy. This I conceive to be the principal duty of an historian, that he suppress no instance of virtue, and that by the dread of future infamy, and the censures of posterity, men may be deterred from detestable actions and prostitute speeches. In short, such was the abomination of those times, so prevailing the contagion of flattery, that not the first nobles, whose obnoxious splendor found protection in obsequiousness, but all who had been consuls, a great part of such had been praetors, and even many of the unregistered senators, strove for priority in the vileness and excess of their votes. There is a tradition that Tiberius, as often as he went out of the Senate, was wont to cry out in Greek, "O men prepared for bondage!" Even he, who could not bear public liberty, nauseated this prostitute tameness of slaves. Hence, by degrees, they proceeded from acts of abasement to those of vengeance. Gaius Silanus, proconsul of Asia, accused by these our allies of robbing the public, was impleaded by Mamercus Scaurus, once consul, Junius Otho, praetor, and Brutidius Niger, aedile. They both charged him with violating the divinity of Augustus, and with despising the majesty of Tiberius. Mamercus boasted that he had imitated the great examples of old, that Lucius Cotta was accused by Scipio, Servius Galba by Cato the censor, Publius Rutilius by Marcus Scaurus, as if by such crimes as these had ever been avenged by Scipio and Cato, or by that very Scaurus, whom this Mamercus, his great-grandson, and the reproach of his progenitors, was now disgracing by the vile occupation of an informer. The old employment of Junius Otho was that of a schoolmaster. Thence, being by the power of Sejanus created a senator, he labored by notorious attempts to triumph over the baseness of his original. Brutidius abounded in worthy accomplishments, and, had he proceeded in the upright road, was in the ready way to every the most distinguished honor. But eagerness hurried him, while he pushed to surpass his first equals, afterwards his superiors, and at last his own very hopes, a course which has overwhelmed even many virtuous men, who, scorning acquirements that came slow, but attended with security, grasped at such as were sudden, though linked to destruction. Gellius Publicola and Marcus Paconius increased the number of the accusers, the former quaestor to Silanus, the other his lieutenant. Neither was it doubted but the accused was guilty of cruelty and extortion, but he was beset with a series of hardships, dangerous even to the innocent, when, besides so many senators, his foes, he was to reply single to the most eloquent pleaders of all Asia, chosen purposely to accuse him, ignorant himself of pleading, and beset with capital terrors, a circumstance which disables the most practised eloquence. Neither did Tiberius spare him, but with an angry voice and countenance daunted and interrupted him with incessant questions, nor was he allowed to refute or evade them, nay, was often forced to confess, lest the emperor should have asked in vain. The slaves, too, of Silanus, in order to be examined by torturers, were delivered in sale to the city steward, that none of his relations might engage to assist him. When his life was thus at stake, crimes of treason were subjoined, a sure bar to all help and a seal upon their lips. Having therefore requested an interval of a few days, he dropped all defence, and tried the emperor by a memorial, in which he menaced him with a public odium, and blended expostulations with prayers. Tiberius, the better to palliate by precedent his purposes against Silanus, caused to be recited a representation from Augustus concerning Valesius Messala, proconsul of the same province, and the decree of the Senate was made against him. He then asked Lucius Piso his opinion. Piso, after a long preface of the emperor's clemency, proposed to interdict Silanus from fire and water, and to banish him into the island Gyarus. The rest voted the same thing, only that Cnaeus Lentulus moved that the estate descending from his mother Cornelia should be distinguished from his own and restored to his son. Tiberius assented, but Cornelius Dolabella, pursuing his old strain of adulation, and having first exposed the morals of Silanus, added, that no man of profligate manners and marked with infamy should be admitted to the lot of provinces, and of this their character the prince was to judge. Transgressions, he said, were punished by the laws, but how much more merciful would it be to prevent transgressors, more merciful to the men themselves, more to the provinces. Against this Tiberius reasoned that, in truth, he was not ignorant of the prevailing rumors concerning the conduct of Silanus, but establishments must not be built upon rumors. In the administration of provinces, many had disappointed our hopes, and many our fears. Some were, by the great weight of affairs, roused into vigilance and adamant; others degenerated and sunk under them. The prince could not within his own view comprise all things, nor was it at all expedient for him to make himself answerable for the characters of other men, engaged in pursuits of ambition. Laws were therefore appointed against facts committed, because all things future are hid in uncertainty. Such were the institutions of our ancestors, that if crimes proceeded, punishments were to follow. Nor should they change establishments wisely contrived and always approved. The prince had already sufficiency of burdens, and even sufficiency of power. The authority of the laws decreased when that of the prince advanced, nor was sovereignty to be exercised when the laws would serve. A popular speech, and the more joyfully heard, as acts of popularity were rare with Tiberius. To it he added, prudent as he was in mitigating excesses, where his own proper resentments did not control him, that Gyarus was an unhospitable island and devoid of human culture, that, in favour to the Junian family, and to a patrician lately of their own order, they should allow him for his place of exile the isle of Cythera, that this too was the request of Torquata, the sister of Silanus, a vestal virgin of primitive sanctity. This motion prevailed. The Cyrenians were afterwards heard, and Cassius Cordus, charged by them and impleaded by Ancarius Priscus for plundering the province, was condemned. Lucius Annius, a Roman knight, was impeached of treason, for that he had converted in effigies of the prince into common usages of silver, but Tiberius withstood, admitting him as a criminal. Against this acquittal Attius Capito openly declared his protest from an affected spirit of liberty, for that the emperor ought not to snatch from the fathers the power of penalties, nor ought such a mighty iniquity to pass unpunished. He indeed might be passive under his own grievances, but let him not give up the indignation of the Senate and the injuries done to the commonwealth. Tiberius considered rather the drift of these words than the expression, and persisted in his interposition. The infamy of Capito was the more signal, because, learned as he was in laws human and divine, he thus debased the dignity of the state and his own personal accomplishments. The next was a religious debate, in what temple to place the gift vowed by the Roman knights to Fortune still the equestrian, for the recovery of Livia. For, though in the city were many temples to this goddess, yet none had that title. At last it was discovered that at Antium was one thus named, and as all the religious institutions in the cities of Italy, all the temples and statues of the deities, were included in the jurisdiction and sovereignty of Rome, the gift was ordered to be presented there. While matters of religion were on foot, the answer lately deferred concerning Servius Meligonensis, priest of Jupiter, was now produced by Tiberius, who recited a statute of the pontiffs, that, when the priest of Jupiter was taken ill, he might, with the consent of the chief pontiff, be absent 2 nights, except on days of public sacrifices, and never more than twice in the same year. This regulation, made under Augustus, sufficiently showed that a year's absence and the administration of provinces were not allowed to the priest of Jupiter. He likewise quoted the example of Lucius Metellus, chief pontiff, who restrained to Rome Aulus Postumius, who was under that character. So the lot of Asia was conferred on that consular who was next in seniority to Meligonensis. During this time, Lepidus asked leave of the Senate to strengthen and beautify at his expense the Basilic of Paulus, a peculiar monument of the Aemilian family. For even then it was usual with private men to be magnificent in public structures, nor had Augustus blamed Taurus, Philippus, or Balbus for applying their overflowing wealth or the spoils of the enemy towards the decoration of the city and the perpetuation of their own fame. By their example, Lepidus, though but moderately rich, revived the venerable glory of his ancestors. But, as the theatre of Pompey was consumed by accidental fire, Tiberius undertook to rebuild it, because none of the family were equal to the charge, and promised that it should, however, be called still by the name of Pompey. At the same time he celebrated the praises of Sejanus, and to his vigilance and efforts ascribed it, that a flame so violent was stopped at one building only. Hence the fathers decreed a statue to Sejanus, to be placed under the theatre of Pompey. Nor was it long after that the emperor, when he dignified Junius Blisus with the ensigns of triumph, declared that, in honor of Sejanus, he did it, for to Sejanus Blisus was uncle. Yet the actions of Blisus were entitled to so much distinction, for Tacferinus, though often repulsed, was still repairing his forces in the heart of Africa, had arrived to such a pitch of arrogance that he sent ambassadors to Tiberius with demands for a settlement to himself and his army. Otherwise he threatened everlasting war. They say that upon no occasion did ever Tiberius, for any insult offered himself in the Roman name, manifest a more sensible indignation, that a deserter and a robber should presume to offer terms like an equal foe, when even to Spartacus no concession was being made, received, and treated under the sanction of the public faith, while, after the slaughter of so many consular armies, he still carried, with impunity, fire and desolation through Italy, though the commonwealth was then gasping under 2 mighty wars, with Sertorius and Mithridates. Much less was Tacferinus, a freebooter, to be bought off by terms of peace and concession of lands, whilst the Roman people enjoyed to the highest pitch of glory and power. Hence he commissioned Blisus to engage by the hopes of indemnity all his followers, to lay down their arms, but to get into his hands the leader himself by whatever means. So that by this pardon many were brought over, and the war was forthwith prosecuted against him by stratagems not unlike his own. For as he, who in strength of men was unequal, but in arts of stealth and pillaging superior, made his incursions in separate bands, and thence could at once elude any attack of ours, and harass us by ambushes of his, so on our side 3 distinct routes were resolved, and 3 several bodies formed. Scipio, the proconsul's lieutenant, commanded on that quarter whence Tacferinus had made his depredations against the Lepidanians, and then his retreat amongst the Gramites. In another quarter Blisus, the son, led a band of his own, to protect the territory of the Cirtensians from ravages. Between both marched the proconsul himself, with the flower of the army, erecting forts, and casting up entrenchments in convenient places. By these dispositions he sorely cramped the foe, and rendered all their movements dangerous, for, whichever way they turned, still some party of the Roman forces was upon them, in front, in flank, and often at their heels, and by this means many were slain or made prisoners. This triple army was again split by Blasus into bands still smaller, and over each a centurion of tried bravery placed. Neither did he, as usual at the end of the season, draw off his forces from the field, or dispose them into winter quarters in the old province, but, as in the first heat of war, having raised more forts, he dispatched light parties, acquainted with the wilderness, who drove Tacfarinas before them, continually shifting his huts, till, having taken his brother, he retreated, too suddenly, however, for the good of the province, as there were still left behind instruments to rekindle the war. But Tiberius took it for concluded, and likewise granted to Blasus that he should be by the legions saluted imperator, an ancient honour, usually done to the old Roman captains, who, upon those successful exploits for their country, were, in the shouts and vehemence of victory, thus complimented by their armies. And there have been at once several imperators, without any preeminence of one over the rest. It was a title vouchsafed to some, even by Augustus, and now, for the last time, by Tiberius to Blasus. This year died two illustrious Romans, Asinius Salonius, splendid in his relations and descent, as Marcus Agrippa and Asinius Pollio were his grandfathers. Drusus, his half-brother, and himself betrothed to the emperor's granddaughter, and Ateius Capito, already mentioned, in civil acquirements the principal man in Rome. As to descent, his grandfather was only a centurion under Sulla, but his father arrived to the praetorship. Augustus had pushed him early into the consulship, that, by the grandeur of that office, he might be set above Astistius Labio, who excelled in equal accomplishments. For that age produced together these two ornaments of peace, but Labio preserved unstained a spirit of liberty, and thence was more the object of popular renown, while Capito gained by obsequiousness greater credit with those who bore rule. The former, as he was never suffered to rise beyond the praetorship, met with matter of praise from a source of injury. To the other, with the glory of the consulate, accrued likewise the envy, and, with envy, hatred. Junia, too, now 64 years after the battle of Philippi, finished her course, the niece of Cato, sister of Brutus, and wife of Cassius. Her will made much noise amongst the populace, for that being immensely rich, and having honourably distinguished with legacies almost all the great men of Rome, she omitted Tiberius, an omission which he took civilly, nor hindered her panegyric from being pronounced in public, nor her funeral from being celebrated with other customary solemnities. Before it were borne the images of 20 the most noble families, the Manlii, the Quinctii, and other names of equal lustre, but superior to all shone Cassius and Brutus, on this very account, that their images were not with the rest seen now. End of section 28. And end of the complete works of Tacitus, Volume 1. Translated and edited by Thomas Gordon.